In the gray light before dawn, a small frontier farmstead bustled with quiet tension. A family hitched oxen to a creaking covered wagon piled high with supplies: flour sacks, dried beans, tools, and cherished keepsakes. Chickens clucked sleepily in their coop, unaware that by sunrise their home would be left behind. The air was chilly and still. A young mother named Clara adjusted her bonnet with trembling fingers as she glanced at the familiar outlines of their cabin and barn one last time. Beside her, her husband Jacob gently placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. They both understood that once they rolled out, they might never see this place, or the loved ones in it, again. With a deep breath, Jacob mustered a smile for their children, urging courage and hope even as his own heart ached. Neighbors and relatives gathered in the yard to bid farewell. Clara's sister pressed a small Bible into her hands. Her elderly father cleared his throat, swallowing emotion. Words felt inadequate. Instead, they exchanged long hugs and tearful smiles. Little Eli, just 5 years old, clung to his grandmother's skirts until she gently pried him loose. 12-year-old Anna stood quietly, eyes wide, committing every detail to memory. The curl of smoke from the chimney, the oak tree where she had swung on a tire, the faces of cousins and friends lined with worry and forced cheer. A rooster crowed, announcing the dawn, and it was time. Jacob climbed onto the wagon seat and took up the reins. Clara helped Anna and Eli settle into a nest of blankets in the wagon bed, where a few favorite toys peeked out from the bundles. Clara herself would walk alongside at first. They all knew the oxen had a heavy load, and every able-bodied person must walk much of the 2,000-mile trek. With a flick of the reins and a soft command, the oxen leaned forward. The wagon's wheels began to turn with a wooden groan. As the wagon lurched onto the rutted lane, the family turned to wave through misty eyes. Loved ones called out blessings. "Godspeed, right when you can. We'll miss you," their voices catching in their throats. The pioneers understood this parting might be final. One emigrant's diary captured the heart-wrenching moment of setting off. "We bade them what we then thought a final farewell, and with heavy hearts proceeded upon our almost endless journey, casting a last lingering glance upon our old and much beloved friends, and also over the beautiful little town in which we had spent many a pleasant hour." In that spirit, Jacob and Clara left their home with hearts as heavy as the wagon they trailed, watching their loved ones and homestead recede into the distance until they became small specks against the dawn. As the wagon joined the country road, a cool breeze whispered through the tall prairie grass. It carried the scent of dew and earth, and something else. A faint echo that to Clara sounded like farewell. She shivered, recalling the diarist's words about the wind repeating a lonesome farewell. Forever. Wrapping her shawl tighter, she steadied herself. Their journey had begun. An almost sacred quiet fell over the procession as other wagons from neighboring farms merged onto the road. By prearrangement, several families in the county planned to travel together for safety and company. One by one, wagons emerged from distant farm lanes like tributaries flowing into a river. Some travelers were friends or kin. Others had only met in the weeks of preparation. They nodded greetings as their wagons fell into line. There was comfort in numbers. A wagon train was forming, bound westward toward the great unknown. Clara walked alongside their wagon, her boots damp from the dew-laden grass by the road's edge. In her apron pocket, she carried a cotton handkerchief damp with tears shed in private the night before. Now, though, she kept her chin high for the children's sake. Little Eli peeked out from the wagon canvas, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Anna walked a few paces behind her mother, leading the family's milk cow by a rope. The girl's free hand trailed along the tall wildflowers that bordered the road, her fingers coming away yellow with pollen. She was old enough to grasp the solemnity of this goodbye, but young enough to find adventure in the trail ahead. Clara listened as Anna softly reassured the lowing cow, a familiar chore that brought a sense of normalcy to this extraordinary morning. As the sun's first rays broke over the horizon, the landscape around them glowed in hues of gold and pink. Jacob guided the wagon westward, casting a long shadow on the road. Behind them, their home dwindled to a dot, and then vanished entirely. In that moment, each family member felt a mix of grief and hope. Hope, because beyond the sadness of departure lay the promise of a new life in Oregon's fertile valleys, free land, and open skies. Grief, because they were leaving everything and everyone they had ever known. It was a bittersweet dawn, etched in their memories forever. The wagons creaked, and the oxen's hoofs thudded dully on the earth. A few chickens tied in crates clucked nervously at the motion. From another wagon ahead, a dog trotted alongside, occasionally circling back with a questioning bark as if to urge the slower teams on. An older boy from a neighboring wagon jogged back to check on Jacob's family. "Doing all right, Mrs. Hale?" he asked Clara politely. She mustered a smile and replied, "Yes," thanking him. In truth, her heart was pounding, and not just from the brisk walk. The reality of what they faced was sinking in. Nearly 5 months of travel across prairies, mountains, and deserts lay ahead, a prospect both daunting and exhilarating. By mid-morning, the wagon train had covered several miles. The town was far behind, and the road stretched ahead, a double track of wagon ruts through rolling prairie. Wild birds flitted across the sky. The children gradually shook off their drowsiness and began to chatter. Eli asked endless questions. "How many days till we see buffalo? Where will we sleep tonight? Did you pack my marbles?" His mother answered patiently, grateful for the distraction. Anna walked in step with Clara, eyes on the horizon, where a ribbon of trees marked a distant creek. She had overheard her parents speaking in hushed tones the night before, worried about river crossings and storms. But this morning, with the sun warm on her face and a chorus of meadowlarks singing, those fears felt far away. At noon, the train halted in a grassy meadow by a clear stream. This was their first nooning on the trail, a practice that would become routine. Oxen were unyoked and led to water and grass. Clara and Anna prepared a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and cold ham left over from yesterday's kitchen. The pioneers ate sitting on wagon tongues or blankets spread on the ground. Some were still too emotional to have much appetite, but they forced themselves to eat, knowing they needed strength. The adults spoke quietly of the morning's progress, while children from different families began to play together, loosening the barriers of shyness. A few boys waded in the creek, whooping at the cold water. Girls gathered wildflowers and compared treasures, a pretty pebble, a bird's feather. These small, joyful moments lightened the mood. Clara took a moment to jot in her journal, a habit she hoped to keep each day. Her pencil moved across the page as she described the parting at dawn, the beauty of the prairie morning, and the lump that still sat in her throat despite it all. She wrote of how proud she was of Anna and Eli, how bravely they were behaving. She also admitted her own anxieties, confiding to her diary fears she wouldn't voice aloud, that the journey was so long and uncertain that disease or accident might befall them, that Oregon might not live up to their dreams. As she wrote, 2 teardrops smudged the ink. Clara quickly blotted them with her apron, drawing a steadying breath. When she looked up, Jacob was coming toward her with the oxen, his face ruddy from exertion but smiling. It was time to hitch up and continue. By late afternoon, the wagon train passed a small settlement, the last outpost of civilization before the true frontier. A cluster of wooden buildings stood at a crossroad, a blacksmith shop, a tiny general store, an inn for travelers. Several wagons turned in to take on one more load of feed or to have a quick repair done. But Jacob's family and others pressed on, eager to make a few more miles before camp. They had already spent weeks gathering supplies in the bigger towns back east, like Independence and St. Joseph, which served as famous jumping-off points for the Oregon Trail. The Hales and their companions had departed from Independence, Missouri, where the frenzy of emigrant preparations still echoed in their minds. The crowded streets filled with wagons, oxen, and people shouting offers for gear and guides. The storefronts advertising flour, bacon, and gunpowder. The blacksmiths furiously shoeing oxen and horses. Now all that lay behind them. One by one, the trappings of their old world were falling away until only the wilderness remained ahead. That evening, they made camp on an open plain near a grove of cottonwood trees. The sky was painted with the soft purples and oranges of sunset. Wagons drew into a loose circle, not as an impenetrable fortification, but as a practical corral for their animals and a cozy semblance of a village. Wagon circling was a ritual that offered a sense of security and community. Within the circle, children played tag underfoot as fires were lit for supper. Clara and Anna joined the other women in slicing onions and potatoes and frying salt pork over a shared fire, the aroma rising and mingling with wood smoke. Men tended the livestock, yoking the oxen loosely to graze, watering the horses and milk cows, and checking that each wagon's tongue and axle were sound after the first day's travel. Around one fire, a fiddle emerged from a wagon, and soon a gentle tune floated through camp. It was a familiar melody from home, and several voices hummed or sang snatches of lyrics. The song brought a wistful smile to Clara's face. Eli was already drowsing in her lap after the long day, and she rocked him gently in time with the music. For the first time since morning, her heart felt lighter. They had made it through day 1. Here they were under the vast sky, a family together embarking on the grand adventure they had talked of for months. Jacob sat beside her and squeezed her hand. "Not so bad, eh?" he said softly. Clara nodded. The grief of parting was still there, but now it was tempered by the simple routine of trail life. Walking, eating, setting camp. A rhythm that promised to carry them onward. After supper, Jacob unrolled the family's bedding inside the wagon, while Clara took the children aside for bedtime. The night air was crisp, and the stars emerged in brilliant clusters across the dome of heaven. Anna gasped at how many more stars she could see out here, far from any town lights. Mother and daughter spread quilts and buffalo robes across the wagon bed. They tucked Eli in between them, and Clara led a quiet prayer of thanks for a safe beginning. In the distance, a coyote yipped, and she felt the boy's hand clutch hers. "It's all right, my love," she whispered. "That's just a prairie song." The nearly full moon cast a pearly light across the plains, illuminating the silhouettes of wagons and the grazing shapes of oxen just beyond the circle. A few campfires still flickered, where men kept watch in turns. But mostly, all was still. Clara found that sleep came fitfully. She lay on her back in the wagon, listening to the soft snores of her children and the occasional clang of a cowbell outside. Her mind drifted to those they'd left behind. Her parents, her sister, the neighbors who were like family. Were they thinking of the Hales tonight? Perhaps saying a prayer for them? She imagined her mother at that very hour, setting an extra candle in the window as she had promised, to guide you home in spirit wherever you are. Clara blinked back a tear in the darkness. Home was now this wagon, these loved ones sleeping beside her, and the road yet to travel. Not far away, at another wagon, a young black man named William lay awake as well, gazing up at the stars from under the wagon rather than inside it. William was traveling with the Morrison family, who had hired him as a teamster. He was one of the few people of color in the wagon train, a free black man with deep brown eyes that held both hope and worry. For William, leaving Missouri was an especially poignant gamble. Missouri was a slave state, and although he was free, life there had been perilous. Oregon promised a fresh start, land of his own, perhaps even a chance to bring his younger brother out later. Yet he had heard unsettling rumors that Oregon's provisional government did not welcome black settlers, even threatening harsh laws to keep them out. William tried to push those thoughts away. Reaching Oregon was months away, and who knew what might change by then. For now, he found solace in the journey itself. The broad sweep of prairie above him was freedom incarnate. As he listened to the distant lullaby of insects and frogs by a nearby stream, he allowed himself a quiet smile. Out here on the trail, he felt equal to any man, a pioneer chasing a dream. That first night on the Oregon Trail passed quietly. In the morning, the pioneers awoke to a silvery layer of dew on the grass and a pink glow in the eastern sky. Women rekindled fires to brew coffee and fry Johnny cakes. Men rounded up the oxen that had wandered a short distance to graze. The routine of breaking camp began. Tents were struck and loaded, bedding rolled up, kettles scrubbed out with sand. Anna helped gather kindling for the next campsite, while Eli chased a grasshopper through the brush. There was a subtle excitement in the crisp air. Despite stiff muscles and slight soreness from yesterday's walk, nearly everyone felt heartened. They were really doing it, heading west into the great expanse, one day's march at a time. The unknown road beckoned, and with it, the promise of a new life. Before setting out, Jacob led his family a short distance up a small rise near the camp. From there, they could see back eastward along the trail they had come. In the far distance, perhaps, lay their home and the loved ones praying for them. Clara took Jacob's hand, and then each of them took the children's. In unison, they whispered a goodbye carried by the wind. Then they turned toward the west, where the morning sun was shining its golden light on the path ahead. It was time to continue their journey into a day that would bring new sights and challenges. With hearts still tender from their farewells but bolstered by determination, the Hale family climbed onto their wagon and rejoined the slow-moving column of the wagon train. The Oregon Trail stretched before them, and they were ready to face whatever it would bring, together. Chapter 2. Trail life begins. By the second day, the emigrants began to settle into the rhythms of trail life. Each dawn brought the sounds of camp springing to life, roosters crowing, firewood crackling, voices murmuring morning prayers or gentle wake-up calls. The novelty of the journey had not yet worn off, and a sense of cautious optimism pervaded the camp. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes and peered out from wagons to see a vast prairie gilded by the rising sun. For young Anna Hale, it felt like waking into a moving painting. Each day an ever-changing canvas of grass, sky, and cloud. She helped her mother fold their canvas tent and load it, both of them moving quietly so as not to disturb Eli, who still dozed curled in a blanket in the wagon bed. Not far away, William hitched the oxen to the Morrisons' wagon, his breath visible in the cool dawn air. The beasts snorted and shook their heads as he adjusted their yokes. He spoke to them in a soothing tone, calling each by name. Many pioneers treated their oxen and mules with great care, knowing their own survival depended on these loyal animals to haul them across the continent. William's team responded to his calm confidence, leaning into their wooden yoke patiently. As sunlight spilled over the grasslands, he led them toward the rutted trail where other wagons were already lining up to depart. By 7 o'clock, the wagon train was once again creaking westward. Dust puffed up under the wheels and hooves, catching golden in the slanting sun rays. The train stretched out over half a mile, connected by an invisible thread of shared purpose. Up front, the captain of their wagon company, a grizzled farmer named Isaiah Marsh, rode on horseback. He had been elected as leader due to his experience and steady demeanor. He would select campsites, decide when to ford rivers or wait, and act as mediator in any disputes. For now, Marsh simply rode with eyes scanning the horizon, alert for the best route through a patch of boggy ground ahead. Jacob Hale walked beside his oxen with slow, long strides, conserving their strength. He carried a hickory walking stick that he used to gently tap the led oxen's flanks and guide them. Occasionally he gave a low cluck or a gee and haw to direct them right or left. Clara was farther back along the wagon, keeping an eye on Anna and Eli. Eli had insisted on walking after breakfast, proudly imitating the older boys by picking up a sturdy stick to poke at interesting things along the road. Clara stayed close, mindful of the child's safety near the hulking wagon wheels. Other families also had youngsters trotting alongside or riding for a spell, then hopping off to run. The wagon train moved at around 2 miles per hour, a pace easy for an adult to walk, though for small children it could be tiring. But on this fresh morning, their energy seemed boundless. The trail they followed was well marked by the caravans that had gone before. Ruts scored the earth, sometimes so, deep that wagons jostled and tilted when wheels slipped into them. Over time, multiple parallel tracks formed as emigrants tried to find smoother ground beside the main ruts. Here on the early stretch in Kansas Territory, not yet a state in those days, the terrain was gentle, rolling prairies dotted with wildflowers, occasional groves of trees along creek banks, and an endless dome of sky. It was spring, so the grass was lush and green, a welcome sight for the animals pulling the wagons. Long days of travel lay ahead before they would reach truly arid country, and everyone wanted to make good use of the favorable conditions. By mid-morning, the sun climbed higher and the day warmed. Women took off their sunbonnets briefly to wipe perspiration before donning them again to shield their faces and necks from the relentless glare. Trail dust began to rise in clouds under the feet of hundreds of oxen and the round iron rims of wagon wheels. Soon, a fine layer of dust settled on clothing and skin. Anna amused her little brother by making a fingerprint on his dusty sleeve, only for the powdery film to cover it again moments later. They laughed, finding it funny now, though they would come to loathe the ever-present dust in the weeks ahead. One emigrant in another party had written that the choking dust and heat defined the overland journey as much as anything. For now, at least the morning breeze kept it somewhat at bay. They encountered their first real challenge late that morning. A low-lying marshy area where spring rains had turned the ground to muck. Wagon after wagon bogged down in the sloughs, wheels sinking nearly to the hub in places. "Double up, team," came the cry from the lead wagon. This was the signal to bring additional oxen to pull out a stuck wagon. Jacob called to a friend behind him, and together they hitched two teams to one wagon, the combined strength slowly wrenching it free from the mud's grasp amid shouts and cracking whips, cracked in the air, more to encourage than strike the beasts. One diary from a pioneer woman described such a day. A constant succession of bad sloughs made the traveling very difficult. Indeed, by midday, nearly all the emigrants were smeared with mud up to their knees from the labor of prying wagons loose. But there was an upside. While halted, they were joined by another small group of wagons that had been traveling separately. Grateful for help through the mire, those families merged into their company. "We have been joined by friends, and now have 6 teams and near 70 head of cattle," the same diary noted cheerfully. With each challenge overcome, camaraderie within the wagon train grew. Once past the marsh, the wagon train paused on a drier ridge for a much-needed noon rest. People tended to their mud-splattered oxen first, checking hooves for stones and giving them a rub-down with handfuls of dry grass. The animals' sides heaved from the exertion, but a half-hour munching sweet prairie grass did wonders for their strength. Meanwhile, Clara and some of the other women broke out their sack lunches assembled that morning. Usually cold leftovers, as there was little time to cook at noon. Clara set out bread and butter with a drizzle of molasses for the children, along with some pickles to cut the sweetness. As they ate, they could look back and see the treacherous marsh behind them, scored with deep ruts and puddles. Already, that mess was one for the storybooks. Little Eli pointed with a bread crust at a distant cluster of animals grazing beyond the creek. "Cows?" he asked. Jacob shaded his eyes and grinned. "Buffalo," he said. Heads turned up and down the wagon line. Sure enough, several dark shapes were moving slowly on the horizon. This was everyone's first sight of bison, and excitement rippled through the camp. Though far off, the mere presence of buffalo made it clear they were truly on the Great Plains now, leaving settled farmlands behind. Some of the men talked eagerly of hunting one for fresh meat when opportunity allowed. To frontier folk, buffalo were nearly mythical creatures of the West. Seeing them in person was a milestone. However, Wise voices reminded the group that it was unwise to scatter and chase game unless provisions ran low. They had plenty of food for now, and the herds were much farther out on the plains. So the buffalo were left undisturbed, and the emigrants watched with reverence until the creatures moved out of sight. As the train got moving again, the afternoon grew hot. The sun beat down on the wagons, turning them into little ovens under their canvas covers. Children grew cranky, and adults footsore. During one break, Anna overheard a few teenagers grumbling that they wished they could ride horses instead of plod along in the dust. But spare horses were few, and those mostly reserved for scouting ahead or emergencies. Almost everyone walked to spare the animals and lighten the load. Clara tried to keep Eli entertained by pointing out curiosities: a butterfly fluttering over a thistle, a hawk circling high above, the funny shapes of clouds. They sang simple songs, "Oh, Susanna," and hymns like "Shall We Gather at the River," their voices blending with others up and down the line. It lifted their spirits and kept a steady walking rhythm. Soon they found themselves traversing vast prairie flats with grass swaying waist-high. There was a sense of exposure under the open sky, like tiny boats in a green sea. Occasionally they would come across the weathered remains of a previous caravan's campsite, a circle of ashen stones from a fire, maybe an item discarded by those who came before, a broken chair leg, an old shoe. Each relic reminded them that countless others had passed this way. It was comforting in a manner. They were not the first to brave this trail, and would not be the last. In the late afternoon, the wagon train reached a broad river that sparkled in the sun. This was the Big Blue River, one of the early water barriers they would face. Fortunately, at this location the river was shallow enough to ford. Still, crossing any river demanded caution and cooperation. The captain called a halt to assess the ford. A couple of experienced riders waded in on horseback, testing the bottom and current. Determining it was firm enough, they signaled the wagons to proceed one at a time. Jacob drove his oxen into the water, Clara walking just behind the wagon holding Eli's hand and guiding the cow. The cool water swirled up to the animals' bellies, and the wagon wheels half disappeared beneath the surface. "Steady now," Jacob murmured to the oxen. The wagon creaked as the current tugged at it. For a tense moment, one wheel hit a submerged rock with a jolt. The wagon lurched, and Anna, riding inside to stay dry, clutched the sideboard to avoid tumbling out. But then, with a squelch of mud, the wheel found purchase and rolled on. They emerged on the far bank, dripping but safe. One by one, each wagon made the crossing successfully, some with more drama than others. One nearly got stuck in midstream until additional oxen were hitched to pull it out amid much shouting and straining. Afterward, as they regrouped on the western bank, there were congratulations all around on another hurdle cleared. A few wet hems and a bar of soap lost to the river, washed off an ox yoke, were a small price to pay. That evening, camp was made under a stand of cottonwood trees near the river. This idyllic spot offered fresh water, ample grass, and wood for fires, the trifecta of a good campsite. As the sun dipped low, the cottonwood's leaves rustled with a soothing, papery sound in the breeze. Women took the opportunity to do a bit of washing by the riverside, scrubbing mud from garments and hanging shirts and skirts on branches to dry. The children, freed from the day's confinement, laughed and played tag around the wagons. A group of boys, including Eli with his new friends, found a small sloping bank and gleefully slid down it, staining their pants anew with dirt, to their mother's chagrin. Anna, on the cusp of her teens, gravitated toward a cluster of girls her age. They compared notes on the journey so far and helped each other brush the tangles out of their hair. Already sun and wind had kissed their faces with freckles and a ruddy glow. Supper that night was heartier, thanks to a lucky trade. One of the newly joined wagons had extra fresh pork from a hog they slaughtered just before leaving home. They traded some pork chops for coffee and sugar from the Hales, and another family. Thus, sizzling pork and gravy made the rounds, a welcome change from the usual salt pork and beans. Clara even produced a treat: dried apples rehydrated and sweetened into a simple pie. She shared slices with neighbors, and in return was offered a cup of fresh milk. Precious luxury from the cow of a family that still had enough feed for her to produce. Around the fires, the mood was upbeat. They toasted with tin cups of coffee and tea to a successful day. Voices murmured about how many miles they might have covered, perhaps 15, and that if all went this well, they'd be in Oregon by fall with no trouble. Of course, the veterans among them knew hardships would come, but there was no harm in enjoying a fine spring evening. After dinner, the adults talked while tending small tasks, mending a harness here, jotting in a diary there. Jacob sat whittling a piece of wood into a toy for Eli as he chatted with Isaiah Marsh and a couple of others. They discussed the trail ahead. Tomorrow they aimed to reach a known landmark, a lone elm tree by a creek, often used as a waypoint. Marsh relayed advice he'd heard from an old mountain man in Independence. Conserve water on dry stretches, keep the axles greased, and never push the animals too hard in one go. The men nodded, absorbing every tip like gospel. The women's conversation, around another fire, drifted to thoughts of home. Already some wondered how their gardens were faring without them, or who might be using their butter churn or quilting frame left behind. But they also spoke of Oregon's promise, repeating what they'd heard, that the Willamette Valley's soil was as rich as river bottom land, that crops grew effortlessly large, that there were groves of oak and cedar and wild berries in abundance. "We'll build new homes and have our own orchards," Clara said softly, stirring the embers with a stick. Saying it out loud made it feel more real. Before turning in, Clara walked down to the river's edge alone. The moon had risen, casting a silver path on the gently flowing water. Frogs croaked along the banks. She closed her eyes and listened to the night sounds. Insects trilled, and across camp she could hear a lullaby being sung to a restless child. Clara murmured a quiet prayer of thanks that her family was safe and that they had good company on the trail. In her heart, she felt the first small bloom of confidence. They were just at the journey's beginning, but every step westward, muddy slough or shimmering river, proved they could overcome difficulties together. Trail life, with all its routines and surprises, was beginning to feel familiar, as if they'd been pioneers all their lives. In one wagon, a young woman named Sarah penned a letter by candlelight to her folks back in Illinois. She described the daily routine of waking at dawn, walking all day, and camping at night. The days already blend one into the next with the simple pattern of travel, she wrote. We rise with the sun, move with the sun, and sleep under the stars. Last night we camped by a stream, and the frogs sang us to sleep. I feel both far away and strangely at home, out here on the open plains." She folded the letter, knowing it might be weeks or months before she could send it from some fort or trading post ahead. Still, writing it made her feel connected to those she loved. As the emigrants drifted to sleep that night, a gentle breeze cooled the prairie. Overhead, the Milky Way arched across the sky like a promise. Parents tucked children into bedrolls, soothing their sunburned cheeks and blistered feet. Some wagons had canvas covers that could be buttoned closed for privacy and warmth, while others left flaps open to catch any breeze. In the hail wagon, Eli curled against his mother and fell asleep almost instantly, exhausted by the day's adventures. Anna whispered to Clara, asking if tomorrow would be as hard as today. "Perhaps," her mother replied, brushing the girl's hair back. "But we'll manage, dear. We'll greet whatever comes with the same courage you showed slogging through that mud this morning." Anna smiled, proud to be spoken of as courageous. In truth, when the wagon was stuck and men shouted urgently, she had been scared. But she saw how everyone pitched in and no one was left behind. That thought reassured her now. Out on the prairie, darkness took on a life of its own. The hoot of an owl in the cottonwoods echoed over the whisper of the river. A few guard duties were assigned. Each night, a handful of men took turns staying up to watch over the camp, keeping an eye out for any dangers, wild animals prowling, or to ensure the oxen didn't stray too far. William had volunteered for the first watch. He stood at the edge of camp, rifle in the crook of his arm, more as a walking stick than a weapon, and marveled at the immensity of the night. He had known dark nights in Missouri's countryside, but nothing like this. Here, there were no lantern lights from neighboring farms, no distant glow of a town. The wilderness was absolute and enveloping. And yet, he felt unafraid. The stars provided a friendly canopy, and the low drone of snores, the cry of a baby quickly comforted by its mother, the soft nicker of a tethered horse. All these subtle sounds of his wagon family gave a sense of community, even in the wild. William found himself humming an old spiritual, the tune low and soothing, as he walked a circuit around the sleeping wagons. This, too, was trail life, the quiet duty and simple pleasure of watching over your companions as they rested. So the night passed peacefully, and with first light, the cycle began anew. The Oregon Trail was starting to imprint its routines on the travelers. They were learning to live with the land and weather, to face obstacles together, and to savor the small joys, a cool drink, a warm fire, a shared song. In the days to come, this hard but straightforward life would bind them closer and test their resolve in equal measure. But for now, on these first mild spring nights and gentle days, the pioneers found trail life not only manageable, but at times deeply rewarding. The journey was truly underway, and with each passing league, they grew more confident that they could endure whatever lay ahead on the long road to Oregon. Chapter 3. Prairie Horizons and Daily Routines. A wagon train forges steadily across the rolling prairie, the wooden wheels cutting twin ruts through the sea of grass beneath a vast blue sky. Each day on the open prairie began to take on a comforting sameness, even as the landscape slowly changed. Morning after morning, the wagon train awoke to the pastel colors of sunrise spreading across an endless sky. On the Great Plains of Nebraska, The horizon was so flat and far that the pioneers often remarked they could see the curve of the earth. The prairie stretched out in gentle undulations, dotted with clumps of sagebrush and spring wildflowers. To the emigrants coming from the wooded eastern states, this openness was both eerie and magnificent. "Not a house along here, do we see? Nothing but prairie with now and then a little skirt of timber along some little streams," one traveler noted, calling it a very good introduction to the lonesome plains. Lonesome or not, the plains had a serene beauty that sank into their souls. By now, a few weeks into the journey, the Hales and their companions had firmly established their daily routine. Before dawn, the camp crier, a rotating duty among the men, would rise and blow a horn or fire a single rifle shot to signal it was time to stir. Slowly, people crawled out of their bedrolls, stretching aching muscles. The nights were growing milder as spring advanced, but it was still chilly at first light. Campfires from the previous night were coaxed back to life, and soon the smells of wood smoke and boiling coffee mixed with the crisp morning air. Clara typically awoke with Eli curled against her, and Anna's arm thrown over them both. She would gently extricate herself to start breakfast, while Jacob checked on the oxen. The children's first task each morning was to gather buffalo chips when firewood was scarce. On the treeless prairie, dried bison dung served as a handy fuel that burned with little smoke. It might have seemed odd or distasteful at first, but they quickly adapted. Anna and a few other youngsters made a game of it, seeing who could collect the most chips in their burlap sack as they scoured the nearby ground. "Go on, gather fuel for Mother's fire," Clara would encourage, and off they ran, returning with giggles and triumphant handfuls of the dried patties. On some evenings and mornings where wood was absent, many a pioneer pot was boiled over a buffalo chip fire, which imparted surprisingly little odor. As one diary noted, the camp often had no wood except a few small sticks, but we made our supper by eating sea biscuits and using chips for heat. Thankfully, on the fertile plains near rivers, driftwood and occasional trees offered more traditional fuel. Either way, the necessity made them resourceful. Breakfast was usually simple but hearty. Coffee or tea for adults, maybe warm milk for children if cows were giving, and staples like biscuits, bacon, or cornmeal mush. Leftover cornbread might be crumbled with a bit of sugar for a makeshift cereal. Some mornings, when time allowed, Clara fried biscuits or johnny cakes on a griddle, their edges crisping in the bacon grease saved from dinner. There was a comforting normalcy in these domestic tasks performed out under the open sky. The clink of tin cups, the murmur of a blessing spoken over breakfast, the sight of neighbors tending their own fires. These little scenes made the wagon camp feel like a village on wheels. By sunup, the camp bustled with purposeful motion. Tents came down, bedding was repacked, the wagons were reloaded with any items taken out overnight. Each family quickly learned efficiency, assigning jobs to everyone old enough to help. Teenage boys rounded up oxen that had grazed during the night. Often the animals were turned loose with hobbled legs or tethered to a stake so they could eat but not wander far. Younger children helped wash tin plates in the nearest creek or puddle and shook out blankets still damp with dew. Mothers made last-minute checks that nothing was left behind at the campsite, a dropped bonnet or spoon, because turning back for it later would be impractical. Then came the morning yoke up, when the ox teams were hitched to the wagons anew. This could be a test of patience and strength. Oxen, though generally docile, sometimes had their own ideas after a night of grazing. A few stubborn ones would dodge away from the yoke or stand still as stone despite clucks and tugs. Jacob and William often helped each other during this process, adding their muscle and know-how to ensure each pair of oxen was securely fastened under the wooden yoke and chains properly attached to the wagon tongue. Once yoked, the animals usually settled into their role, but their initial reluctance provided morning entertainment for the rest of the camp. Good-natured ribbing was common. "Bill, looks like your ox wants a holiday. Put a corn cob in front of him, that'll get him moving." Laughter would ripple, lightening everyone's mood for the day ahead. By about 7:30 or 8 a.m., the wagon master would give the shout to move out. One by one, the wagons lurched forward, falling into the loose formation they'd established. They didn't necessarily travel in a tight single file all day. Often terrain dictated multiple parallel tracks, and wagons might spread out a bit to avoid each other's dust. Families rotated positions so no one ate dust every day, though those at the very rear always had it worst. The Hales found themselves towards the middle or back on many days, which was fine with them. From there, they could watch the procession snake ahead, a reassuring sight, and still not be last. As they walked, the emigrants often occupied themselves with conversation or singing to pass the time. The adults discussed their old homes, their future plans, or news they'd heard back at the jumping-off point. Like the latest on gold strikes in California, or the progress of railroad lines creeping west. Many were curious about one another's reasons for making the arduous journey. Some, like the Hales, dreamed of rich farmland and a homestead to call their own. Others were enticed by opportunity, perhaps to start a business or to escape debts. A few were missionaries or adventurers. William shared with Jacob some of his story, how as a free black man he yearned for a place where he could stake a claim and live without the constant fear of slave catchers or prejudiced laws. Jacob listened thoughtfully, acknowledging the injustice that even free men like William might face legal barriers in Oregon. Quietly, he assured William that if it came to it, their group would stick together and find a solution, perhaps settling just north of the Columbia River, beyond the jurisdiction of Oregon's provisional government, where the Hudson's Bay Company still had influence and greater tolerance. It was a conversation held in low tones while the wagons creaked along, but one that bonded the two men with mutual respect. For the children, the trail was an ever-changing source of wonder. Anna began keeping a list in her journal of all the new animals and plants she encountered. By mid-spring on the prairies, they had seen prairie dogs popping up from their burrows, to the delight of all the kids, heard coyotes howling at night, and spotted pronghorn antelope bounding in the distance. One day a herd of deer crossed far ahead of the wagon train, graceful and swift. Another day, they found sun-bleached buffalo bones near a dried waterhole, eerie remnants of the great herds. "Saw several buffalo skeletons in our tramp," an emigrant had written, and indeed these sights reminded them that life and death played out plainly on the plains. Anna pressed a prairie flower between pages of her diary and sketched the outline of an antelope she glimpsed. Meanwhile, Eli busied himself collecting interesting rocks, of which there were plenty. he proudly showed his mother a pretty piece of flint he found, which they kept to possibly use with their steel striker for starting fires if needed. The social dynamics of the wagon train also evolved as days passed. Families that had been strangers now grew friendly, sharing chores and stories. In the evenings, people often gathered around common campfires, not just within their own family circle. The sound of laughter became more frequent, even as they faced daily toils. When the weather was fair and the road forgiving, spirits ran high. Some evenings, younger folks would even organize simple dances, the fiddler playing a reel while a few couples shuffled in the grass, boots tapping, much to everyone's amusement. The older generation might not dance, but they clapped along or tapped their toes. It was remarkable how music and a bit of mirth could transform the wilderness into a ballroom under the stars. However, not every day was easy. There were mornings when the camp woke to dreary rain, making everything soggy and morale low. One pioneer woman wrote of a very hard rain with thunder and wind, after which the company found themselves rather a dreary company in the morning. Such was the case when a spring storm rolled through one night, flattening tents and drenching bedding. By dawn, a chilly wind blew under an iron-gray sky. The emigrants huddled in wet clothes, trying to light fires with damp wood and chip. Breakfast that day was meager and eaten shivering. Mud turned the trail to a morass again, and travel was laborious. Yet even on that miserable morning, they succeeded in getting some breakfast and picked up to start anew. Isaiah Marsh went from wagon to wagon, cracking jokes about them all looking like drowned prairie rats, drawing chuckles even from the grumpiest travelers. And indeed, by midday, the sun peeked out, warming their backs and drying their skirts as they trudged on. They learned to take the bad weather with the good, knowing that perseverance was the only path forward. The routine also included periodic rest days, typically on Sundays for those who observed the Sabbath. Many wagon trains chose to rest once a week, giving people and animals a break. On such days, no miles were covered. Instead, they might do extra chores like washing a load of clothes, repairing wagon parts, or writing letters. Some held informal church services under the open sky. One Sunday, the Hales train halted in a grassy grove by a gentle creek. They declared a day of rest. Clara and a few others did laundry by the stream, scrubbing garments on washboards and laying them on bushes to dry in the sun. A preacher among them gave a short sermon at mid-morning. They sang hymns like "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing," with a fervor that echoed over the plains. It was a peaceful, regenerative time. The children especially delighted in a whole day to play. They improvised toys, a rope swing from a tree branch, dolls fashioned out of corn husks and scraps, pretend forts built of willow sticks. That evening felt almost like a day back home, with everyone cleaned up, clothes mended, and spirits refreshed. One aspect of daily routine that tested everyone's nerves was health and hygiene. The pioneers quickly realized that good sanitation was vital, though it was difficult under the circumstances. They dug little privy pits away from water sources each time they camped, and then filled them before leaving. They tried to boil river water, or at least mix it into coffee or tea, suspecting that raw water might carry illness. Indeed, stories abounded of cholera outbreaks on the trail. As they advanced along the Platte River in Nebraska, a broad, shallow stream they would follow for hundreds of miles. Fresh graves became a common sight. Sometimes they passed wooden grave markers with penciled names and dates from just weeks earlier. A solemn hush would fall on the train at each such site. Once they counted 5 new-made graves in a single day along the renowned landmark Chimney Rock. It was a stark reminder that not everyone survived this trek. The cause was often cholera, a swift and deadly disease. Travelers believed cholera lurked in the Platte's muddy waters or the unsanitary conditions of crowded trains. Martha Reed, an emigrant, later wrote of how they only drank boiled water as tea or coffee, and thus escaped cholera while others fell ill. Clara took those lessons to heart. She diligently boiled water for their cooking and reserved a bit of precious whiskey to mix with river water for the oxen, thinking it might kill any miasma, bad air, or contagion. Fortunately, in these early weeks, no sickness struck their camp, but the awareness of it was ever present. Every night, as part of routine, someone recorded the events of the day in a diary or journal. This role often fell to the literate young women or men. In the Hales case, Clara made brief entries, but Anna too started writing in her own small diary. She noted the highlights. Passed a grave marked for a little girl today. Mama cried when she saw it. Or saw 3 buffalo in the distance this morning. Pa says maybe more will come as we go further. She also listed camp locations. Camped by Lone Willow Spring. Water tasted of minerals, but still cool. These entries would serve as memories later, and also as guidance to future emigrants if letters got sent back home. The wagon train was now nearing one of the famous milestones of the Oregon Trail, Fort Laramie. For weeks they had been moving northwest, following the Platte River's gentle course. Spring had turned to early summer. The Platte Valley offered relatively easy travel. Broad, flat, though monotonous at times. They passed signature landmarks that raised cheers among the group. Chimney Rock, a tall spire of clay and rock that had been visible for days before they finally drew near its base. They marveled at its imposing height and peculiar shape, pausing to let everyone carve their names on its soft surface or on the cliff of Scott's Bluff nearby, joining the many inscriptions left by pioneers and even mountain men before them. Independence Rock was another such place, back a bit earlier on the trail, where they had similarly celebrated by etching initials and dates, a ritual saying, "I was here." This graffito of hope, etched in stone or painted on wagon boards, made them feel part of the grand history of westward expansion. Now Fort Laramie was just ahead, a trading post and U.S. Army outpost at the confluence of the Laramie and North Platte rivers. Reaching it felt like a graduation of sorts. It meant they had traversed about a third of the journey and were leaving the familiar plains for gateway into the mountains. As the wagon train approached the fort on a bright June morning, excitement ran high. Travelers put on cleaner clothes if they had them, eager to make a good appearance. Children were thrilled at the prospect of a fort. Visions of soldiers, cowboys, maybe even Native Americans trading, danced in their minds. When they finally arrived, the scene did not disappoint. Fort Laramie in the 1840s was a bustling hub of the wilderness. Long, low adobe and log buildings formed a square around an open ground. Soldiers in blue uniforms milled about alongside buckskin-clad trappers, and native tribespeople who had come to trade. Teepees of the Lakota Sioux and other tribes stood just beyond the fort's walls, and native families could be seen bartering buffalo robes and beadwork for rifles, powder, and cloth. The emigrants rolled in with a mix of relief and curiosity. For some, it was the first time seeing Native Americans up close. Women and children peered from wagon covers as a group of Sioux men on horseback rode by, painted and proud, quivers of arrows on their backs, checking out the newcomers. There was nervousness, but the presence of the fort gave a sense of security, and indeed most interactions here were peaceful. The Sioux around Fort Laramie were interested in trade more than conflict at this time, and many had friendly relations with the fort's traders. The wagon train set camp near the fort for 2 nights, a welcome layover. They spread out in a designated area where dozens of other emigrant wagons were also parked. It was like a great convention of pioneers, people swapping stories from those who started earlier in the spring, news from back east, and rumors about conditions ahead. Clara struck up conversation with a woman from another train who had just come down from Fort Laramie's sutler store, trading post. "They have calico at $1 a yard and flour at exorbitant prices," the woman reported. Clara realized their own supplies were holding out well. No need to pay a premium here. However, they did use the fort's post office. Jacob carefully penned a letter home by the light of a lantern, informing family in Missouri that they were safe so far. He included a special note from Anna to her cousins, and had little Eli scribble his mark as well. 2 of the company's men crossed the river on a ferry to deliver these precious letters to the fort's mail agent, who promised to send them east with the next dispatch. At Fort Laramie, they also encountered the Sioux in a social context. One afternoon, a group of Sioux women, whom the pioneers called squaws in the language of the day, came into the emigrant camp, displaying moccasins and beautifully quilled leather bags for trade. Clara felt a surge of apprehension. She'd heard tales, often exaggerated, of Indian raids. But these women were smiling and curious, admiring the emigrant children and trinkets. The pioneers soon found themselves engaged in friendly barter. Margaret Frink, a diarist on the trail in 1850, had noted that Sioux women were pleased to see a white squaw willing to trade and talk. Similarly, Clara found that offering some tin cups and an old shawl earned her in return a finely beaded belt and a pair of moccasins that fit Anna perfectly. Anna was thrilled, not just with the pretty footwear, but with the interaction. She tried on a few words of the Lakota language that she'd picked up from a fort interpreter, drawing delighted laughter from the Sioux women. They spent a pleasant hour together, a small moment of cross-cultural friendship on a trail often remembered only for conflict. Of course, the pioneers remained cautious, but many later remarked that this encounter at Laramie was one of their positive memories. For William, Fort Laramie offered an interesting revelation. Among the motley crowd, he met another black man, one of the few African-American mountain men, possibly an employee of the fur company. They greeted each other warmly, exchanging the news. The mountain man, with grizzled beard and weathered skin, mentioned a name that made William's eyes widen. Black Moses Harris, a legendary black trail guide. Moses Black Harris had been a trapper and had guided wagon trains, even helping some emigrants who were lost. Though Harris himself wasn't present, He had passed away a couple of years earlier, in 1849, of cholera. His story inspired William. It underscored that people of color had a place in this frontier history too, as guides, traders, and pioneers. William shared a bit about George, another black pioneer in their group, who traveled with the Simmons family, and how they planned to head perhaps north to Puget Sound due to Oregon's exclusion laws. The mountain man nodded with understanding and offered some advice on the Columbia crossing later. To see someone like himself who had survived and even thrived out here gave William renewed hope. Leaving Fort Laramie, the pioneers felt a mixture of rejuvenation and the gravity of what lay ahead. The fort was the last vestige of U.S. government presence they'd see for a long stretch. Ahead loomed the Rocky Mountains, though at first they would still travel through high plains and river valleys leading to the Continental Divide. As they rolled out, a two-wagon family that had been debating whether to continue or turn back made their decision to continue on with the Hale party. They had lost an infant to fever a week before reaching the fort, and were heartsick. Fort Laramie, with its small graveyard, had nearly tempted them to settle there or return east. But the kindness of other emigrants and a determination to make their baby's sacrifice meaningful pushed them onward. The wagon train embraced them with sympathy. Clara in particular spent time consoling the grieving mother, Mary, as they walked. Such sorrows and solidarities became part of the fabric of trail life. They mourned together, then lifted each other to carry on. With Fort Laramie behind them, the routine of prairie travel continued, but the landmarks came in faster succession now, each one a milestone and a morale boost. Independence Rock, which many reached by early July, and where pioneers traditionally celebrated July 4th if timing was right. Devil's Gate, a stunning cleft in the rock carved by the Sweetwater River. Then the gradual ascent toward the Continental Divide at South Pass. On July 4th, the Hale party did indeed pause near Independence Rock, a huge granite outcrop in Wyoming. They climbed it, those who had the strength, and carved or painted their names among the thousands there, adding 1852 or so to mark the year. They sang patriotic songs that evening and even fired off a few gunshots into the air as a makeshift salute. One diary recorded how thankful a group was to celebrate another American Independence Day here in these lonesome wilds, grateful to be alive and together. That sentiment rang true for the Hales and their company. Though footsore and dusty, they had thus far avoided major calamity. By this stage, their daily routine was second nature. Early rise, harness, trek, noon rest, often by some stream or at least where grass was decent, trek again, then make camp by late afternoon or early evening near water if humanly possible. The men could practically yoke oxen in their sleep. The women could start a fire in any weather and whip up a meal from scant supplies without complaint. The children, once soft from homestead life, were now lean and hardy, legs used to many miles a day. Even 5-year-old Eli managed several miles on foot each day, riding only when utterly exhausted. The older kids became adept at small tasks, bringing water, staking animals, gathering fuel. All of them learned to be vigilant for dangers, too, keeping an eye out for rattlesnakes. Several had been seen or heard buzzing their warnings near the trail, making sure little ones didn't stray too far and get lost, watching the sky for sudden storms. Yet for all the hardship, there were profound moments of prairie tranquility. Some evenings, after supper, Clara and Jacob would stroll a little beyond the wagons, hand in hand, and gaze at the sunset together. The sky in these high plains dazzled them with colors: amber, rose, violet, spreading unhindered across the horizon. The grass would catch the light like a rippling lake of gold. In those quiet minutes, the exhaustion of the day melted away, replaced by a sense of peace. Jacob once remarked softly to Clara, "All this space and beauty, hard to believe we are but tiny travelers in it." She nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. They felt fortunate, despite everything, to witness such sights. Many nights, after the children slept, they found themselves talking in low tones about their future farm in Oregon, how they'd build the house, where to plant an orchard, maybe which spot by a creek to claim. Dreaming aloud in the darkness kept their resolve strong. Thus, as the wagon train pressed on through the last of the prairie and into the foothills of the Rockies, their daily rituals and hard-won trail wisdom carried them forward. The road so far had forged them into a cohesive band, almost an extended family, capable of tackling whatever came next. They had learned how to live on the trail, embracing early mornings, enduring long, dusty afternoons, helping each other without hesitation, and finding grace notes of joy amid strenuous days. It was a life stripped to essentials and routine, yet full of unexpected wonder and quiet contentment. In the chapters ahead, the challenges would mount. The steeper climbs, scarcer water, and greater dangers. But the foundation of resilience and community they built here on the open prairie would see them through the toughest trials of the Oregon Trail. Chapter 4: Trials by River and Storm. As the wagon train journeyed onward, they encountered the first truly formidable natural obstacles of the trail: treacherous river crossings and sudden violent storms on the high plains. These trials tested their ingenuity and courage, becoming pivotal chapters in their westward saga. Yet even in danger, the pioneers strove to maintain the calm, steady pace of their pilgrimage, for panic could be as deadly as any river current. They learned to read the land and sky, to prepare as best they could, and to trust in one another when the elements raged. The Platte River, which had been a friendly guide and water source, now posed a major challenge. In western Nebraska, they needed to cross from the south bank to the north bank, or vice versa, depending on the route, to continue toward the mountains. The Platte was wide, nearly a mile across in places, but usually shallow. Often emigrants could ford it with wagons, but the danger lay in hidden deeper channels and the risk of quicksand-like bottoms. The Hale Wagon Company decided to cross at a well-known ford used by many trains. They arrived to find a crowd of emigrants anxiously gathered. A pair of small ferry scows operated by enterprising frontier men offered passage, but at a steep price and with long waits. Some impatient groups had attempted to ford on their own. As the Hales prepared, they witnessed the tail end of a tragedy that had occurred that morning. An older diary entry had described a similar event. Emigrants trying to cross with oxen not chained properly to a ferry boat, resulting in a catastrophe. Here and now, one wagon from another train had misjudged the depth. Midway through the river, a team of oxen panicked as the water rose to their backs. The swift current caught the wagon box, lifting it slightly. In an instant, the wagon tipped and overturned, spilling cargo and people into the muddy torrent. Shouts rang out. Other emigrants on the banks rushed to help, diving in or pushing out on horseback. They managed to rescue the driver and one child, but heartbreakingly, a teenage boy and one of the ferrymen who had been assisting were swept under and drowned. The entire community was shaken by the sight of a grieving father wailing on the shore, having lost his son before his very eyes. Such scenes left an indelible mark. Jacob held Eli and Anna close as they watched men downriver pull the lifeless, soaked bodies from the water. Clara could hardly breathe, clutching a hand to her mouth. It was a sobering reminder that the trail's perils were not just stories. Determined to avoid a similar fate, the wagon train consulted and decided to caulk their wagon beds and float across, a method often used when fords were doubtful. They spent a full day preparing, removing the wagon boxes from the running gear, sealing every seam with tar and pitch. Some carried small buckets of tar for this purpose. They also fashioned makeshift rafts by lashing together timber from empty barrels and spare planks under the wagon box to increase buoyancy. Everything inside the wagons was elevated or secured. Heavy items were repositioned to balance weight. Some even wrapped their more delicate belongings in canvas and tied them to the tops of the wagon covers to keep them dry. All hands pitched in. William proved adept with tar and wood, and under his guidance, their wagons became crude boats. On the chosen afternoon, when the wind was calm, they led the oxen and other livestock across first. Men on horseback flanked the herd, guiding them towards the opposite bank at a slight angle to compensate for the current. The animals swam or waded, lowing anxiously but keeping together. The water reached the larger oxen's horns at the deepest parts, but they kept paddling until their hooves touched bottom again, and they scrambled up onto the far shore, dripping and snorting. Watching their faithful oxen safely across gave the pioneers courage. Next came the wagons. Stripped of extra weight and riding low in the water, each wagon box was floated across with ropes and manpower. Some men swam alongside. Others rode in the wagons using long poles to push off the riverbed, gondola style. Clara and the children, along with most women, crossed separately in the ferry scow for safety. Despite the cost in dollars, they deemed it well worth it after the prior accident. They watched with bated breath as their wagons bobbed in the chocolate-brown water. One wagon snagged on a submerged log midstream and listed dangerously. A chorus of shouts, "Heave! Push!" went up. Jacob and two others, chest deep in water, wrestled with the log, finally dislodging it and freeing the wagon to float again. After what felt like ages but was only minutes, all wagons were guided to the opposite bank. They cheered and praised God for deliverance. Wet but elated, they set to reassembling the wagons, greasing wheels and hitching up teams to move away from the river that had almost claimed victims. That night in camp, they held a prayer of thanksgiving and also one of remembrance for the family that lost their boy. The pioneers were learning that on the trail, triumph and tragedy walked hand in hand, separated by fate and caution. Beyond the Platte, the trail entered drier, rockier country, approaching Wyoming. Here the weather took on a volatile character. In the high plains and approaching mountain elevations, thunderstorms could brew quickly, unleashing fierce winds, hail, and flashes of lightning that spooked the bravest souls. One late afternoon, as they were crossing a broad stretch of open plain with not a tree in sight, The sky to the west grew dark and tumulous. Boiling blue-black clouds piled up like mountains in the sky. Birds fell silent. The air took on an electric charge. Isaiah Marsh, experienced enough to read these omens, rode down the line yelling for wagons to tighten up and prepare for a blow. They hastily convened the train into a tighter formation. Canvas covers were fastened down securely, extra ropes thrown over top to prevent them from ripping away. Everyone donned coats or grabbed blankets in case of hail. Oxen were left hitched to wagons to provide stability, an unspoken trust that the animals would not bolt. They didn't wait long. With a sudden roar, the storm was upon them. Sheets of rain slammed into the wagon canvas with percussive force. Wind lashed the prairie, flattening the grass and making the wagon covers snap like gunshots. Then came the hail, marble-sized balls of ice pelting man and beast. The oxen moaned and huddled against the wagons for a modicum of shelter. Clara and the children were inside their wagon when the tempest hit. At first, thunder boomed overhead so violently it rattled tin plates from their hooks. Lightning flashes strobed through the drawn canvas, turning night to day and back in split seconds. One bolt struck alarmingly close, a blinding flash and an immediate crack that shook the ground. Eli shrieked and clung to Clara, who wrapped him in her shawl, whispering soothing words though her own heart raced. Anna squeezed her mother's other arm, eyes wide but resolute, humming a hymn softly to keep calm. Outside, Jacob and William fought to secure a flapping wagon cover on a neighbor's rig. Rain drenched them to the bone. Hailstones stung their faces. "Keep your heads down," someone shouted over the maelstrom. They crouched by wagon wheels as wind-driven debris, twigs, bits of prairie chaff, whirled dangerously around. One tent that hadn't been stowed in time blew off into the dark swirl, gone forever. And then, as abruptly as it arrived, the storm moved on. Within 30 minutes, the worst had passed. The rain gentled to a patter, the hail ceased. Thunder rumbled in the distance, chasing the black clouds eastward. A strange calm fell, broken only by the dripping of water from wagon tongues and the hysterical bleating of a terrified goat someone had brought along. People emerged slowly, shaken but grateful to be alive. A quick head count showed no one seriously hurt. A few bruises from hail, nothing more. One of the oxen teams had broken loose and run a short distance, but they were caught without incident. The greatest damage was to belongings. Some bedding and flour got wet where covers leaked or blew open. A hard lesson was reinforced. Nature's fury on the plains was no small matter. Later, reading others' accounts, they found solace that their experience was typical. Last night we experienced all the realities of a Platte River storm. The rain fell in torrents, the thunder and lightning were to some the most terrific, and to others the most sublime. Indeed, some pioneers found a fearful awe in these storms. Jacob admitted that once the initial terror passed, watching the lightning dance across the plains was oddly beautiful, like a grand fireworks show of the gods. The next morning, a rainbow appeared as the sun rose, arching over the wet prairie. The children ran outside excitedly to admire it, a symbol of promise after the storm. Wagons and clothes steamed in the early sun as people draped everything damp over shrubs and wagon tongues to dry before moving on. The air was clean and cool. The prairie seemed refreshed, glistening with raindrops. If not for the dents in the wagon covers from hail and some lost sleep, one could forget how harrowing the previous evening had been. As the journey progressed, they crossed more rivers, some by ferry, some by ford, but none as frightening as that Platte experience. Still, each crossing carried drama. The Big Sandy, a tributary in Wyoming, had a quicksand bottom that claimed one of the train's oxen when it stumbled and couldn't be pulled out in time. They lost an animal, but fortunately, no people in that incident. Later, the Green River required a ferry payment, which the group grudgingly paid in gold dust and coin, since attempting a swim with wagons, there was suicide. At one river, they encountered friendly Shoshone Indians who ran a makeshift ferry with bull boats, round boats made of buffalo hides. The Shoshone ferry crew expertly guided some wagons across in exchange for clothing and ammunition. It was here the pioneers learned of the Shoshone name for themselves, New, meaning the people, and that they too considered these lands their home and thoroughfare. The interaction was polite and practical, each side benefiting. Storms visited a few more times as well, though the wagon train grew adept at reading the sky and preparing. They learned to quickly dig rain trenches around tents and wagons when making camp, to channel water away. On high ridges, they avoided camping under solitary trees that might attract lightning, instead clustering wagons in the open and grounding them by dropping chain ends onto the earth. Some of these measures were suggested by a traveling doctor in another party who shared advice at a crossroads. Thus forewarned, one night when a dry lightning storm, lots of lightning but little rain, rolled through near Independence Rock. They watched safely from their wagons without incident, even as several strikes hit the ground a few hundred yards away, sparking little grass fires that sizzled out in the damp of the recent rain. The children counted seconds between flash and boom, turning it into a game to mask their unease. Clara led them in, reciting a comforting Bible verse about thunder being the voice of God, which oddly made them less afraid, as if the storm were a divine spectacle rather than a menace. Alongside these natural trials, the grind of daily travel itself became a test of endurance. By the time they reached South Pass, the gentle, wide saddle in the Rocky Mountains that marked the Continental Divide, many wagons and people were showing wear. The pioneers celebrated cresting the pass, where a traveler could straddle a tiny creek and have one foot in waters flowing to the Atlantic, and the other in waters bound for the Pacific. They were in fact not climbing high snow peaks, but traversing a broad, wind-swept plateau. Still, the significance of crossing the Rockies loomed large in their minds, a psychological victory. They whooped and hollered when the guide pointed out the exact summit of the pass. A few picked up small stones as souvenirs. One woman in the group, however, was too weak to leave her wagon. Cholera had finally touched them some days back, in a most heartbreaking way. One of the company's mothers, Mrs. Taylor, fell ill with severe cramps and dehydration. Despite all efforts, mustard plasters, camphor spirits, and constant prayers, she passed away within 24 hours of the first symptoms. They buried her at a grassy hollow near a clear spring, one of about 70 graves on that part of the trail, as a diary recorded somberly. Her funeral was a quiet affair. They sang, "Nearer my God to thee," while the wind blew ceaselessly over the sage. This loss hit the group hard. Clara, holding Anna's hand at the graveside, wept openly. She had grown close to Mrs. Taylor on their many walks together. The next morning they held a brief memorial and moved on, leaving yet another freshly heaped mound behind. What a sad thing to leave our friends in this uninhabited country, a fellow traveler wrote of a similar moment, and those words echoed in their hearts as the wagons rolled away from the lonely grave. It was the first death in their immediate company, and everyone keenly felt the fragility of their endeavor. However, reaching South Pass soon after provided an emotional upswing. It signified that despite tragedies and trials, they were progressing. They had crossed the backbone of North America. The air was thinner and cooler up here. Some nights a frost dusted their blankets. But beyond the pass, as they descended into what is now western Wyoming and Idaho, they found fresh challenges: the deserts of Snake River country. This was a land of striking contrasts: towering bluffs and plateaus, broad valleys cut by the Snake, also called Lewis River by some diaries, and expanses of sagebrush where the soil was alkaline and water scarce. Dangers shifted from storms and river torrents to heat, dust, and the ever-present risk of wagon accidents on rough terrain. The Snake River itself would accompany them for hundreds of miles toward Oregon. But unlike the Platte, the Snake was a more formidable and less cooperative companion. Its current was swifter, its waters bitter with alkali in places, and its banks often rugged. By late summer, when they reached the Snake, the pioneers were travel-worn. Many oxen were thin, hooves worn to the quick from endless rocks. The wagon wheels, on which so much depended, needed frequent greasing and sometimes replacement of spokes that cracked. The group had consolidated. One family that lost too many oxen combined their belongings with another's wagon and abandoned the extra vehicle, lightening the load on the surviving animals. As they trekked along the Snake's south bank, dust rose in such choking clouds that people tied handkerchiefs over their noses and mouths. Water became the obsession. The Snake was often too far below in canyons to reach easily, and side creeks ran dry or brackish. They encountered stretches where for 20 or 30 miles, no good water was to be had, and their throats and their animals suffered. A diary from one emigrant in August captured it. The country a barren, deserted, burnt-to-death waste. Weather warm enough to bake better food than we have along. Girls look as cross as dry bread. It was said with humor, but it painted the picture vividly. In such moments, morale flagged. Children grew irritable. Adults marched in grim silence, conserving saliva. They pressed on in early morning and late evening, resting in whatever shade they could find during the peak heat of afternoon. The Snake River also forced them into difficult decisions. At one juncture, they needed to cross to avoid an impassable canyon ahead. Some pioneers around them decided to make rafts out of wagon beds and float part of the way downstream to Fort Boise or beyond. This was exceedingly risky, but seemed preferable to exhausting their stock on a long detour through a parched land. The Hale wagon group debated mightily. In the end, given that they still had relatively strong ox teams, they chose to take the established road overland, which involved leaving the Snake for a time and cutting across to rejoin it later. They parted ways with a few wagons that opted for rafting. They saw those folks off at a bend in the river, helping them caulk their wagon boat and load it with only the most essential goods. It was a poignant farewell, both parties knowing the other's route was fraught with perils of its own. The rafters faced drowning or Shoshone Falls, The land party faced thirst and rocky trails. They promised to meet again in the Dalles or Oregon City. As the Hale Company watched the wagon boat party float away, waving hats bravely, Clara whispered a prayer for their safety, and then turned her face to the sun-baked plain they must cross, urging herself to be strong. That land crossing, known as the Dry Drive of the Snake, proved one of the hardest stretches of the journey. They traveled at night under a bright moon to avoid heat, the wagons casting ghostly shadows over the silvered sage. The crunch of wheels on crusted soil and the soft thud of oxen hooves were the only sounds aside from occasional coyote howls. Inside the wagons, children tried to sleep, rocked by the motion, while mothers whispered lullabies. After 36 hours of on and off marching with minimal water, they staggered back to the Snake at a point known to emigrants as Farewell Bend, for it was the last time the trail would meet the river for a long while. True to the place's ominous name, when they arrived, they found the river level low, and the water left was stagnant, fouled by the passage of many cattle. Still, they drank sparingly and let the animals drink under watch. Too much cold water could kill an overheated ox. One of their remaining oxen was too far gone. When it tasted the water, it drank in a frenzy, collapsed, and died on the spot from exhaustion and over-drinking. The group solemnly dragged its carcass aside, grateful it wasn't a person who fell. They left additional belongings behind at Farewell Bend to lighten loads further. Sentimental items like a heavy oak rocking chair that had made it thus far were abandoned, a sacrifice to the trail. The chair belonged to Mary, the mother who had lost her child earlier. She'd hoped to rock future babies in Oregon with it. Letting it go was painful, but Mary herself insisted. Her remaining oxen needed relief, and she said maybe another weary traveler could use it if they came across it. Such were the decisions on the latter part of the Oregon Trail. What do we value more, an heirloom or the lives of our team? In virtually every case, life won out, and mementos, books, even extra food were jettisoned if it meant easing the journey. The trail was littered with these cast-offs, broken wagons, iron stoves, trunks of clothes, forming an eerie breadcrumb trail of human hope and despair. Through all this, though battered by rivers and storms, the wagon train persisted. They consoled each other with the thought that the hardest trials might be behind them. Oregon was drawing nearer, week by week. The mountains and deserts had not defeated them. When they camped by the Burnt River in eastern Oregon after another series of steep hills, they knew the final leg was approaching. The Blue Mountains, and then the Columbia River Gorge. Sitting by the campfire that night, under tall pines for the first time in ages, Clara reflected on how far they had come. They had survived swollen rivers that claimed others' lives, weathered lightning and hail that could have shredded them, and crossed unforgiving wastes where weaker parties might have perished. They bore the scars, graves of loved ones, empty spaces in wagons where precious things once were, scars on their hands from work and perhaps on their hearts from grief. But those trials also forged them into something new, true pioneers, tempered like steel. As she listened to the wind sigh through the pines, Clara closed her eyes and silently thanked Providence for seeing them through the worst. She felt, for the first time, a cautious certainty that they would make it to Oregon. Perhaps not all of them, and certainly not without further hardship. But the promised land was no longer just a dream. It was nearly within reach. Little did she know, some of the most intense moments were yet to come at the Columbia. But the pioneers would face those with the same steady calm they had learned on the trail. By working together, respecting nature's power, mourning their losses yet, moving forward, and never losing sight of why they began this journey in the first place. Each river crossed and storm weathered was a step closer to that greener valley beyond the mountains, and they intended to claim it, come hell or high water. Chapter 5. Encounters on the Frontier. The Oregon Trail was not traveled in isolation. The pioneers shared the road with many others, and along the way they encountered a diverse cast of characters: fur trappers and traders, missionaries, other emigrant trains, and the indigenous peoples who had called these lands home for generations. These interactions ranged from joyous meetings to tense standoffs, from acts of kindness and trade to wary observation. Through it all, the emigrants gained a broader understanding of the world they were crossing. A world not empty, but rich with human life and culture. As they moved into what is now Idaho and eastern Oregon, such encounters became more frequent, often leaving lasting impressions on both parties. One of the most memorable encounters for the Hale family occurred near Fort Hall, a trading post originally established by the British Hudson's Bay Company and now run by Americans. Approaching Fort Hall, they found a gathering of Shoshone, Snake Indians camped by a freshwater spring. These Shoshone families had set up a temporary village of willow pole lodges and buffalo hide teepees, their horses grazing nearby. They were here specifically to trade with passing wagon trains and the fort. As the Hales Company rolled in, several Shoshone men and women approached on horseback, cautiously friendly. They signaled their peaceful intent by holding their palms outward and smiling. The wagon master, Isaiah, rode ahead to greet them, reciprocating the gesture. Though there was a language barrier, they soon managed a rudimentary conversation through sign language and a bit of plains trade jargon that some pioneers had picked up. What unfolded was a lively trade fair atmosphere. The Shoshone had goods to offer: moccasins, tanned leather, dried salmon from the Great Salmon River, root vegetables like camas and yampa, and beautifully woven baskets. The emigrants had items in demand: cotton cloth, knives, beads, and especially firearms or ammunition. Though most were reluctant to trade weapons, some did exchange small amounts of powder or a spare rifle for food. William, with his natural gift for camaraderie, struck up a rapport with a young Shoshone man around his age. They laughed as they compared a shiny brass kettle William offered with a string of fresh fish the Shoshone man had. A trade was made, both satisfied. Clara traded some of her precious tea leaves for a bundle of wild onions and camas bulbs, which the Shoshone women showed her how to roast to a sweet, chestnut-like softness. The pioneers enjoyed this addition to their supper greatly, thankful for new nutrients after so much salted meat and flour diet. Children, as usual, bridged gaps effortlessly. Shoshone kids and emigrant kids eyed each other curiously at first. Then one of Eli's little friends tossed a ball, made of rolled-up socks, toward a Shoshone boy. Soon they were all at play, giggling and chasing one another in an impromptu game of catch that dissolved barriers of language, and custom. Anna found herself drawn to a girl a few years older who shyly admired Anna's calico dress. Through gestures, the Shoshone girl invited Anna to see something. Leading her to a lodge, she revealed an array of beadwork she was crafting. A beautiful floral pattern destined for a marriage outfit, she indicated. Anna clapped in appreciation. In return, Anna showed the girl how she did a simple embroidery on a handkerchief. They exchanged these small pieces of art as keepsakes, an emblem of sisterhood across cultures. During this camp, one evening the pioneers and Shoshone shared a communal feast. The Hales contributed some coffee and sugar, while the Shoshone roasted a venison haunch over the fire. They all sat in a large circle under the stars, passing around tin cups of weak coffee and wooden bowls of broth and meat. Though conversation was limited, they learned a few words of each other's tongues. They discovered that the Shoshone called themselves Niuhi or Numu, depending on the band, which meant the people, and they learned the names of some individuals. The emigrants offered their own names. It was a gentle, amicable meeting. Around the fire, one older Shoshone man began to sing, a low, haunting melody in his language. The pioneers listened respectfully, sensing it was perhaps a song of blessing or history. When he finished, the emigrants responded with a song of their own. Amazing Grace, chosen for its calm and universally moving tune. The Shoshone listened in turn. In that moment, under the vast night sky, both groups experienced a rare sense of shared humanity. They were all travelers in a way, the Shoshone following seasonal rounds across their ancestral lands, the Americans pushing through to a new home. Not all interactions were so idyllic, of course. Earlier on the trail, back in Sioux Territory, western Nebraska, the company had one tense encounter. A band of Lakota Sioux warriors had ridden up as the wagon train paused near the North Platte one noon. They were dressed in full regalia, eagle feather headdresses, faces painted for war, rifles and bows in hand. Their approach was bold and not overtly hostile, but caution spiked among the emigrants. Men quietly gathered their firearms. Women hurriedly ushered children into wagons. The Sioux, perhaps 24 strong, circled the wagons at a distance. Their leader then came forward alone, holding up a hand in greeting. He spoke some words that none in the train understood, but by his gestures they inferred he sought trade or tribute for passing through their lands. This was a known custom. Some Sioux bands demanded a toll, often food or goods, from wagon trains. Isaiah Marsh and a couple of unarmed companions met the Lakota chief between the lines. The chief pointed to the wagon herd of cattle and then rubbed his stomach. He and his men were hungry. Realizing the delicacy of the situation, Marsh agreed to share provisions, rather than risk conflict. The train gave the Sioux a butchered cow, one that was already weakened from travel, and several pounds of coffee and sugar. In exchange, the Sioux leader presented Marsh with a finely worked buffalo robe, a gesture of thanks or perhaps simply the Plains way of sealing the bargain. Both sides parted on cordial terms. But for hours after, as the train moved on, the emigrants felt the eyes of the Sioux on their backs from distant hilltops. One diarist in another train had written that the Sioux appeared very friendly, but also that emigrants were uneasy, being inhabited only by the red man of the forest out there. It summed up the mixture of wariness and reliance. In truth, Outright armed conflict on the Oregon Trail was relatively rare in these early years. Far more common were such negotiations or small thefts. An ox might vanish overnight if left unguarded, presumed taken by desperate natives or opportunistic white outlaws alike. The Hales were relieved their only confrontation had ended peacefully, and they taught their children to always treat the native peoples with respect and caution. Later, in eastern Oregon, near the Blue Mountains, they met Nez Perce and Cayuse Indians, who had a reputation for both helping and, in some tragic instances, clashing with missionaries and settlers. At the Grande Ronde Valley, a beautiful meadowland ringed by mountains, they found a large village of Nez Perce. These people were prosperous horsemen, owning vast herds of Appaloosa horses that dazzled the emigrants. A diary noted, "The Indians at this place are very wealthy. They have numerous herds of horses and possess many of the luxuries of life in abundance." The pioneers certainly perceived that wealth. Warriors sat astride sleek mounts decked with beadwork. Women wore dresses embellished with shells and beads. Yet, contrary to some emigrants' fears, the Nez Perce were welcoming. They rode into the emigrant camp not to demand, but to offer trade and aid. They brought fresh vegetables, onions, potatoes, and salmon. The hungry pioneers eagerly bought food, astonished at the high prices, but grateful. Flour had soared to $40 per hundredweight here at the end of the trail, beyond what many could pay. Some Nez Perce accepted barter in clothes or labor instead of cash. The emigrants also noticed that these Indians had picked up elements of European-style living. Some spoke a little English from mission schools. Some wore woven cloth over buckskin. A few even owned wagons. The cultural blend on the frontier went both ways. One elder Nez Perce man, named Tamanius, as best as they could pronounce it, advised the wagon train about the trail ahead. Through a translator at a Hudson's Bay outpost, he recommended a particular camping spot with good water on the next leg, warned them of a difficult downhill stretch where many wagons had wrecked, and in a solemn tone referenced the site of the Whitman mission down the trail, where a tragic incident had occurred a few years prior, the Whitman Massacre of 1847, though he did not dwell on it, only cautioning them to stick to the main trail and travel swiftly through certain valleys. The pioneers listened intently, thankful for his guidance born of generations living in this land. In response, they gave what gifts they could. A few more rifles to the Nez Perce, which some historians later would note, ironically, that arming tribes would make later conflicts more lethal. But in that moment, it was a gesture of trust and gratitude. Not every meeting was profound. Some were just quick and practical. For instance, they met a group of Mormon migrants going to Utah, traveling the opposite way for a stretch. This was near the Soda Springs, in Idaho. These Mormons, having fresh knowledge of part of the trail, swapped news with the Hales. They spoke of a new settlement by the Great Salt Lake, where they were bound. The Hales marveled at that, imagining people would settle the salt desert by choice. In turn, the Hales informed them of conditions back east. They even exchanged a few supplies. The Mormon group had extra salt from the lake and needed some spare wagon axles which another Oregon party had. Brief crossroads like this were like encountering a mirror of themselves, fellow Americans on a parallel quest, diverging to different promised lands. They waved farewell, shouting, "Good luck," across the sagebrush, as each train resumed its destiny on separate branches of the trail. Through all these encounters, whether with native tribes or fellow pioneers or traders, the children were perhaps most transformed. Anna kept a small notebook where she started writing down unfamiliar words she learned. Tamanwit, a Columbia Plateau word for sacred power, which she heard spoken. Kowtow, a word she misheard from a Chinese laborer at Fort Boise, actually meaning a bow of respect, and bits of Shoshone and Nez Perce vocabulary. She sketched the faces of some of the friends she made, noticing they were not so different from hers. Eli, for his part, proudly wore the beaded belt the Shoshone boy gave him until it barely fit. He played games with pretend characters like Chief Buffalo and Captain Clark, mixing his heroes real and imagined from all he'd heard. The adults, too, found their perceptions deepening. William, reflecting one evening, remarked to Jacob that he'd been moved by how the Nez Perce honored their agreements and helped strangers. "I wonder if we'll treat them the same when we're settled," he said quietly, aware of stories of broken treaties. Jacob, staring into the fire, had no easy answer. He could only hope that peace would prevail, but he knew from history that as more settlers poured in, conflicts over land were likely. Still, he had seen the genuine possibility of friendship. It made him ponder how, in a different world, pioneers and natives might have shared the country, without bloodshed. Clara's key takeaway from these encounters was empathy. The initial fear she'd held of Indians, stoked by sensational tales back east, had given way to understanding that these were families and communities trying to survive and protect what was theirs, just like she was. She often thought of a Nez Perce mother she saw cradling a baby at Grande Ronde, singing a soft lullaby in a language Clara didn't know. The scene was so familiar and tender that Clara realized a mother's love was universal. It made her mourn all the more the violence that had occurred at the Whitman mission, where misunderstandings and mistrust between cultures had erupted into killing. She vowed to remember that lullaby scene as the more true and hopeful picture of cross-cultural contact. As the wagon train drew nearer to the end of its journey, these diverse characters they'd met became part of the story they would carry to Oregon. They would tell newcomers about wise chiefs and friendly traders, warn of which tribes expected gifts, praise the ones who saved them from starvation with food trade, and describe the kindness of a Shoshone guide or the hospitality of a mountain man's cabin. The frontier was populated not just by danger, but by a rough code of mutual aid among travelers. One mountain man they'd met near Fort Boise, Old Caleb, who had trapped beaver in these hills for decades, gave them an irreplaceable gift of knowledge, a sketch map of the trails to take through the Blue Mountains, marking creeks and noting "bad hill here" or "plenty grass here." That scrap of hand-drawn map proved more valuable than gold when they later traversed those very spots. Caleb refused payment beyond a share of their supper and an evening of conversation with civilized folk. He was craving news from back east. By the time the Hales and their companions had Oregon almost in sight, they no longer thought of the land as empty. They knew it was alive with people and stories. They had passed through realms of many nations, the Omaha and Oto near the Missouri, the Pawnee on the Central Plains, Lakota and Cheyenne along the Platte, Shoshone by the Rockies, Umatilla, Cayuse, and Nez Perce in the plateaus, and now they would soon meet the Chinookan peoples along the Columbia. Each had left a mark on their journey, whether through a meal, a memory, or a lesson learned. These encounters also shaped how the pioneers saw themselves. For William especially, meeting Black pioneers at Fort Boise and seeing Moses Harris's name in conversations gave him pride and a sense of lineage in the West. For the women like Clara and Mary, meeting Native women and sharing that motherly bond gave them strength. They were part of a sisterhood of frontier mothers, regardless of color or creed, all protecting their young on this wild journey. And for Jacob and Isaiah, the wagon leaders, negotiating with tribes without violence and with fairness upheld their values. They had heard of emigrant parties shooting at Indians on sight or vice versa, but they made it through without spilling blood, thanks largely to respect and a bit of luck. This they intended to continue in their new home. They agreed that if a local tribe came to their homestead one day, they'd meet them as they did on the trail, with an open hand and hopefully mutual goodwill. Of course, the Oregon they were headed to had its own complex situation. They'd heard that the provisional government had discriminatory laws, like the exclusion of blacks, which worried William's family deeply, and also limitations on native rights. George, the free black man traveling with the Simmons family in their train, openly discussed with William and Jacob his plan. He would not settle south of the Columbia, where Oregon's provisional government's lash law could affect him. Instead, he and his white friend Simmons would cross to the north side, present-day Washington, where British law via Hudson's Bay might offer some refuge. Jacob offered to help them build if needed, even though his claim would be in the Willamette. These bonds forged on the trail were strong. They wouldn't abandon each other at the finish line, legal lines or not. In summary, the encounters on the frontier humanized the journey. They were not just traveling through geography, but through a tapestry of peoples. The Oregon Trail was a meeting ground, sometimes ground of conflict, yes, but also of exchange and learning. As they prepared to descend the last stretch of the Columbia River to the fertile valley, the pioneers carried with them a richer sense of the world. They had stories of generosity to counter the tales of cruelty, friendships to offset fears, and a recognition that they were part of a greater human narrative spanning the continent. They understood that to truly live in the West, they'd need to remember these lessons, to respect their new neighbors, be they fellow settlers of different background or the tribes whose land it was, to treat strangers kindly, and to navigate differences with both courage and compassion. These were precious lessons, gleaned from encounters under summer suns and campfire nights, and they would serve the pioneers well in the new communities they would soon build at Trail's End. Chapter 6. Women on the Trail. Strength and Sacrifice. Among the travelers of the Oregon Trail, the experiences of women were both distinct and profound. It was often said that the women kept the wagon wheels turning, for their labor and emotional fortitude underpinned the entire journey. They rose before dawn to tend children and cook meals, walked all day sometimes pregnant or in heavy skirts, and in the evenings mended clothes by scant firelight and soothed the anxieties of their families. The trail was an equalizer in some ways. Women found themselves driving wagons or standing guard when needed, and men learned to do laundry or rock a crying baby when their wives were too exhausted. Still, women carried unique burdens: the pull of leaving behind aging parents or a beloved home, the risk of childbirth far from any doctor, the task of maintaining morale and gentleness in a rough, uncertain world. This chapter delves into the inner journey of the women pioneers, illuminating their resilience, heartaches, and quiet triumphs. Clara Hale's story was, in many ways, emblematic. A farmer's daughter not yet 30, she had been reluctant at first to uproot her young family for Oregon. It was Jacob's dream more than hers, lured by promises of 640 acres of free land for couples, a fresh start far from economic depressions back east. Clara loved their Missouri home, with its picket fence and lilac bushes she'd planted, the church where she married, and her sister living just a mile away. Yet she understood Jacob's restlessness, and, truthfully, had a kernel of adventure in her too, though she scarcely admitted it. When they decided to go, Clara poured her energies into preparation, sewing canvas wagon sheets, preserving foods, making lists of medicines and tools. It was often the women who thought of the small but vital comforts: a family Bible, a favorite toy, seeds for the new garden, a locket with a loved one's portrait. Clara packed a packet of flower seeds from her lilacs and peonies, determined to bring a piece of home to Oregon soil. On the trail, Clara's days were long and regimented, yet full of unexpected challenges. At dawn, she was the one coaxing the campfire awake to brew coffee and make something to fill stomachs, perhaps cornmeal mush with dried berries or bacon if they could spare it. She dressed wounds and blisters on her family's feet using bacon grease and rags. Walking beside the wagon, she often had one eye on little Eli clambering around and the other on the road ahead for any hazard. She gathered fuel in her apron, stirred the cooking pot at noon breaks, and by nightfall might be comforting a sick neighbor or knitting socks from unraveled yarn of an old sweater, yarn which she had dyed with berries gathered along the Platte. It was unending work, but she performed it with a steadfastness that others in the company came to revere. One bachelor in the train, traveling alone, confided in his diary that seeing Mrs. Hale's wagon always lifted his spirits because she embodied the cheer of home fires even on the prairie. Yet these women had their private moments of breakdown too. Mary Taylor, the woman who lost her child to illness, could barely function for days after. It was Clara who sat with her in the wagon while others drove, helping tend Mary's other children and simply providing a shoulder to cry on. There was a silent, mutual understanding. Clara could not imagine the pain of burying a child on the trail, and Mary could hardly imagine going on, but go on she must for her remaining family. In one entry, Clara wrote with sorrow of that day: "We halted this morning to bury one woman out of our company. She had diarrhea. We had a prayer and a hymn sung. The men made a bark coffin so that she was buried very decent. In that case it was a wife, not a child, but grief was heavy all the same." Clara's gentle leadership among the women, organizing the sewing of a burial shroud and singing a quavering hymn, helped the group process the loss. It was women who often prepared the dead for burial and gave comfort to the living left behind, roles they bore with stoic grace. Women's diaries from the Oregon Trail frequently reveal an emotional landscape the men's often do not. They write of loneliness, of missing the company of other women back home, the ache for news of loved ones. But they also show profound wonder and growth. Margaret Frink, a trail diarist, described the sublime, strange, and wonderful scene of the Rocky Mountains and unique landmarks. Likewise, Clara found unexpected joy in the grandeur of nature. One evening after crossing South Pass, she climbed a small knoll near camp. Below, the sun was setting in a sweep of color behind distant peaks, and far to the west, she thought she glimpsed the sheen of a large river or lake catching the light. It made her heart leap. Could that be the Snake, or even hints of the Columbia beyond? As the sky burned orange and pink, Clara felt a profound assurance kindle in her chest that she was meant to be here, in this wild, wide world, and that she had the strength to see this journey through. The burdens of domestic duty fell away for a moment, and she was simply a soul standing at the threshold of a new land, awestruck. In her journal that night, she wrote a rare poetic line: "Mountains like altars all around, and heaven's light upon them. I felt near to God this eve." The presence of women was also a civilizing influence on the trail communities. Many wagon trains strictly observed a Sunday Sabbath rest, largely at the women's urging. It gave physical rest, yes, but also a semblance of normal life. Putting on a cleaner dress, gathering for a makeshift church service. Clara, along with Sarah, the young woman who wrote letters, and Mrs. Marsh would organize hymns and scriptural readings. These moments of worship or reflection offered comfort. They reminded everyone of the moral codes and faith they carried from home. Moreover, the women coaxed a bit of domestic normalcy into camp life. Somehow someone would find a way to celebrate a child's birthday with a treat of molasses candy, or they'd declare a wash day and take pride hanging relatively clean dresses and shirts on sagebrush to flutter dry, a sight that to passing emigrants looked like a banner of perseverance. Childbirth on the trail was perhaps the ultimate test of a pioneer woman's courage. It was not uncommon that a woman would become pregnant before or during the journey. In those times, delivering a baby without a doctor, only maybe a midwife if another woman had experience, in a tent or wagon with limited sanitation, was incredibly risky. Yet, miraculously, many births went well. In the Hales train, one evening in early September, a cry went out for help at the Morrisons' wagon. Mrs. Morrison was in labor. The train encircled and halted for the night earlier than usual. Women gathered, Clara among them, to assist while men tended the other children and kept the camp quiet and safe. They hung blankets for privacy around the Morrison wagon, heated water, and used the best of their knowledge from past deliveries. Through the long night, they stayed by Mrs. Morrison's side as she labored, her moans muffled into pillows. Prayers were whispered continuously. Past midnight, a new infant's wail pierced the darkness. Then relieved laughter and tears of joy followed. A baby boy was born, alive and healthy, and the mother survived the ordeal, though weak. It felt like a collective victory for the whole wagon train. The next day was declared a rest day in honor of the birth. The men fired off a happy salute in the air, and the women fussed over the tiny babe, wrapping him in soft flannel and giving bits of sugar water. They asked Mrs. Morrison what she'd name him. "Jason," she said after the father's father. But quickly someone quipped he should have a trail nickname. So they dubbed the baby Independence after Independence Rock, near which he was born under that starry sky. Little Indy became a mascot of sorts for the wagon train, a symbol that life continued, that hope was literally born out of hardship. Women also navigated relationships and roles shifting on the trail. Some found their marriages strengthened by mutual reliance, while others felt new strains. The Hales had a strong partnership. Jacob listened to Clara's counsel more and more, respecting her keen observations, like her suggestion to rest the oxen more often in the heat likely saved them animals. They made decisions together, whether about rationing food or helping others. But not all couples fared so well. One young married pair in another wagon quarreled frequently. He would blame her if dinner wasn't ready, or if a pin was lost. And she in turn lamented that he hadn't packed enough proper bedding. The pressures of the trail sometimes erupted in domestic spats. The community of women helped each other through these too. Clara often walked alongside that young wife, listening to her vent frustrations, offering gentle advice from her own years of marriage. In a way, the wagon train's women became an extended sisterhood. They cooked communal meals at times, shared remedies. One had knowledge of herbal medicine, making willow bark tea for fevers and peppermint for indigestion, and watched each other's children. If a mother fell ill, others took on her tasks until she recovered. It was a collective insurance born of empathy. Each knew it could be them in need next. Despite backbreaking work, women carved moments of leisure and craft. Remarkably, pieces of quilts were sewn on the trail, stitch by stitch during relatively smooth rides or lunch breaks. A few women pieced a friendship quilt for a family expecting a baby at journey's end, each block embroidered with their initials and a little symbol: a wagon, a star, a pine tree. It kept their hands busy and hearts united. On calm evenings, they mended torn dresses and darned socks, forming a sewing circle around a lantern, chatting softly about their dreams for Oregon. The houses they'd insist their husbands build. With a good kitchen hearth, mind you, one laughed. The fruit trees they'd plant, the schools and churches they wanted to establish. These conversations were the blueprint of the communities to come, and women were central in envisioning them. Truly, the sacrifices of the trail were often borne in silence by women. It was not just physical discomfort, but also psychological. They were leaving the graves of loved ones behind. Parents who would die while they were away. Children who might never see grandparents again. They left networks of female friends and neighbors that had sustained them in childbirths and harvests before. They carried that loss privately. For instance, Sarah, the letter writer, confided to Clara one night that she worried she'd never marry, given the scarcity of young men after the trail, or that Oregon might lack the society she yearned for. She had been a schoolteacher back east. Clara assured her that opportunity awaited in Oregon, too. She even mused that perhaps out west, women like Sarah could own land or vote in community decisions. Radical thoughts seeded by the independence the trail forced upon them. "We have done things out here I never imagined I could," Clara said, referencing how she had driven the wagon when Jacob fell ill once, or how she had faced down a rattlesnake slithering near camp with a shovel. Sarah nodded, heartened. The trail had revealed their latent strengths. Another poignant narrative was that of Martha, an African-American woman traveling as a free servant with a white family in the train. Martha had been enslaved in Missouri, but freed in a will and hired by the family to help with their 5 children. Quiet and capable, Martha was often on the periphery of camp socializing due to racial divides of the time. But gradually the women folded her into their circle, especially after she heroically saved one of the children from drowning at a river crossing by jumping in after the little girl. After that incident, Clara made a point to publicly thank Martha and insisted she join them by the fire in the evenings. In her reserved way, Martha began sharing her story with the other women, how she left behind her own mother in Missouri, promising to send for her once settled, if possible. The women listened with empathy. Losing family was a universal pain, though Martha's was inflicted by slavery and sales. They gave her comfort, and she them perspective. Martha taught them how to make a hearty stew from almost anything, a skill honed in scarcity. And in Oregon, she planned to start a laundry business. The common trials of the trail built uncommon bridges. At least in this little wagon train, Martha found respect she rarely knew in the antebellum South. It was a small step in a long journey toward equality. But on that trail, in that moment, women of different races laughed and cried together, forging bonds beyond societal norms. Perhaps the culminating testament to the women's role came as they neared journey's end. When the wagon train finally rolled into the Willamette Valley, the men were quick to praise the female travelers. One evening around the final campfire, before dispersing to their claims, Isaiah Marsh raised a tin cup and declared, "To our ladies, harder working than any ox and braver than any scout. We wouldn't be here without them." The cheer that went up was hearty. The women smiled, maybe blushed, but they knew in their hearts the truth of it. They had been the glue holding everything and everyone together. In Oregon, these same women would go on to establish homes out of raw wilderness. They'd endure the first lonely winter in a drafty log cabin as rain drummed on the shakes, keep seeds safe and dry to plant in spring, bear more children with only neighbor women as midwives, and form the backbone of new churches, schools, and social gatherings that turned disparate homesteads into a community. The trail was but the beginning of their pioneering. But having crossed those plains and mountains, they emerged transformed, more confident, seasoned by adversity, and aware of their own capacities. Years later, when their daughters and granddaughters would ask about the Oregon Trail, these women, now matriarchs, would have many tales to tell. They'd recall the time the sourdough starter spilled and how they made bread from cattail pollen instead, or the storm that tore their only spare dress to rags, forcing them to sew a new one from wagon canvas. They'd speak of heartbreak at graves and the exquisite relief of holding a newborn under open sky. Perhaps they'd underplay their heroism, framing it all as what had to be done. But those who listened closely would hear the steel in their voices, the pride behind the modest words. They had conquered the trail in their own right. The unsung strength and sacrifices of the pioneer women were, in the end, the bedrock of the whole endeavor of westward settlement. In every warm loaf of bread, every nursed illness, every educated child in Oregon, the legacy of their journey lived on. Chapter 7. Children of the Wagon Train. Through the eyes of a child, the Oregon Trail was a place of wonder, boredom, terror, and growth all at once. Children were numerous among the emigrants. Families often traveled with half a dozen young ones in tow. These boys and girls experienced the journey differently than their parents. Unburdened by the same worries, they could find adventure in a field of butterflies or an abandoned Indian campsite with arrowheads to collect. But they also suffered discomforts and faced dangers. Long, hot walks that made their small feet blister, the sorrow of losing siblings to illness, or the fear in their parents' eyes during perilous moments. Yet, the trail was an enormous classroom and playground combined. By the time they reached Oregon, these kids were more resilient and worldly than they could have ever become back home. This chapter explores the Oregon Trail through the youthful lens of those it carried west. The children. 8-year-old Anna Hale kept a diary as best she could on the trail. In neat, if large script, she recorded things that struck her as exciting or strange. One entry read, May 27th. We saw our first buffalo today. Pa and some men chased an antelope too, but didn't catch it. Eli found a buffalo skull. I think it's scary, but he wants to keep it. For Anna and her peers, sights like buffalo were like glimpsing characters from storybooks come to life. They had heard so many tales of the West, Indians, buffalo, bears, and now here they were, crossing that storyland. Even the landscape seemed enchanted at times. Another diary snippet. June 14th, Chimney Rock all day in view. It looks like a giant castle from a fairy tale. We passed 2 graves. Ma said to pray for their families. We camped by the river, and no wood, so we used buffalo chips, which is funny. Anna's innocence shines here. She takes note of graves because her mother is visibly moved by them. But almost in the same breath, she finds novelty and humor in the unconventional fuel for their fire. For many children, the trail was a series of endless walking days punctuated by occasional marvels. The older ones had responsibilities. Boys of 10 or 12 might help drive the loose cattle or ride horseback as message runners up and down the wagon line. Girls of the same age often had to mind younger siblings or help their mothers knead dough, wash clothes in a creek, or gather kindling. One can imagine teenaged Lottie carrying her toddler brother on one hip while stirring a pot with the other hand, learning maternal skills far beyond her years because circumstances demanded it. Yet whenever they could snatch free time, the children would play with abandon. They invented games suited to the trail. There was wagon tag, racing around the circled wagons until breathless, or make-believe scenarios where one child was a pioneer and another a wild stallion to be tamed, riding on all fours. They played hide-and-seek among tall grasses, to the consternation of parents who feared they'd truly get lost. With rocks and sticks, they improvised toys. Dolls were fashioned from corn husks or spare cloth, little wagons carved from wood pieces, hoops for rolling made out of barrel bands. The older kids taught younger ones songs to keep them walking in rhythm. She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain, an anachronistic song, which ironically would be written later about pioneers, wasn't around yet, but classics like Oh Susanna and Row Your Boat served the purpose, along with nonsense rhymes that made them giggle. Often, the trail itself provided amusements. When crossing the Great Platte River, for example, what was harrowing for adults could be a thrilling water frolic for kids once safely on the other side. On a sandbar, a gaggle of children might splash and swim under watch, turning the detour into a beach day. When the train encountered enormous herds of grasshoppers or crickets, as sometimes happened on the plains, children chased after them, trying to catch the leaping insects, shrieking and laughing, whereas their parents were fretting about crops and feed. At Independence Rock, while their elders carved names, the children dared each other to climb higher and higher on the Great Dome, turning the landmark into a natural jungle gym. More than one mother had to scold a lad for venturing too far up the steep granite without rope or supervision. A pivotal period for the children's morale was the long trek across the Snake River Plain. This stretch tested even their buoyant spirits. The unrelenting heat, monotony, and thirst wore on them. The game of seeing who could spot something novel first, a distant mountain, or perhaps another caravan's dust plume, lost its charm after weeks in sagebrush desert. Some became listless, others irritable. But then small miracles would happen. Discovering a clear spring with cool water after a dry camp would bring back their exuberance as they splashed their faces and filled bellies. Or cresting a hill to find a view of snowy mountain peaks in summer, like the first glimpse of the Blue Mountains, could trigger excited pointing and chatter among them. "Look, snow in July," they marveled. Illness was perhaps the hardest on children. They were less able to fight off diseases like cholera or measles. Many wagon trains lost more children than adults to the grave. In the Hales group, little Joseph Taylor, brother to the baby who died of cholera, fell ill with what they called mountain fever, possibly typhoid or severe flu. The women and older girls took turns cooling his brow, singing lullabies to keep his spirits calm. Anna spent hours reading to him from a small primer to distract him from pain. When Joseph passed away one night, a hush fell over all the children. Death was not an unfamiliar concept to 19th century kids who often saw siblings die in infancy. Yet, witnessing a friend's burial in a lonely prairie grave was deeply sobering. The kids processed it in various ways. Some cried openly, others went quiet for days. A 5-year-old asked her father, "When will Joseph's mom dig him up and bring him home?" Heartbreakingly innocent, thinking it temporary. The father had to explain that Joseph's home was heaven now, and they felt the weight of what that meant. They were leaving him behind forever. The event changed the children. Many would remember it even into old age as their first encounter with mortality. It also likely instilled in them a kind of resilience, a knowledge that life could be harsh, and they must cherish one another. Children also crossed cultural boundaries in ways adults might not. When the wagon train met Native American groups, the kids were often the first to overcome fear and interact. Shy at first, curiosity soon took over. They would trade trinkets, maybe a toy harmonica for a beaded bracelet, or share treats. Pioneer kids offering hardtack crackers, native kids offering pine nuts. They mimicked each other's languages for fun, giggling at mispronunciations. Such moments were brief but enlightening. Those pioneer children who played with Indian children carried that memory lifelong, sometimes fostering more tolerant views than many of their contemporaries. Education on the trail was catch as catch can. Some parents tried to keep lessons going. In the Hale camp, Sarah, the young teacher, would sometimes gather the kids under a wagon at midday for a bit of schooling, perhaps a few sums on a slate or reading a passage from a book. It wasn't daily, and the curriculum was often nature itself. A geology lesson came in the form of discussing the curious columns of basalt they saw along the Snake River or the pumice they found near volcanic areas. Biology was taught by identifying plants and animals they encountered. Anna learned to identify antelope versus deer, or prairie hens versus sage grouse, not from books, but from life. Once, in Oregon, an emigrant boy proudly pointed out to a new arrival the difference between fir, pine, and cedar trees. Knowledge he picked up from native traders en route. Education far beyond his years compared to children who never left home. Chores were a huge part of children's trail life, and in doing them, they learned responsibility and skill. 10-year-old boys like the Marsh's son, Isaac, quickly became adept at handling oxen with a firm G or haw to direct them. He learned to crack a whip, more for sound than striking, to prod lazy cattle. By arrival, he was practically a teamster. Older girls like 13-year-old Emily could cook a basic meal over an open fire, having done it dozens of times while her mother nursed a baby. She might have started the journey not knowing how to bake bread. She ended it with the ability to mix, knead, and bake a loaf in a Dutch oven nestled in coals, turning it so it baked evenly, coming out golden and surprisingly soft despite coarse flour. Emily would one day tell her own children, "I baked bread for a wagon of 12 at age 13. They might marvel as if it were legend, but to her it was just necessity. Interestingly, the trail also offered more freedom to children in some respects than they had back home on farms. There were no strict school hours, no constant chores of milking and tending, at least not on the same scale. When in camp, and not doing a specific task, kids roamed relatively free in these wide-open spaces, something many loved and later pined for when settled. One boy, years later, reflected, "I never felt so free as a lad as those days when I could run on the prairies, no fences to hold me, racing even the antelope under the endless sky." For him, it was a happy time despite the hardships, and when stuck behind a plow in Oregon, he sometimes nostalgically recalled the adventure. Of course, some dangers lurked in that freedom. Getting lost was a serious risk. There are accounts of children who wandered off and were never found, presumably succumbing to exposure or animals. In the Hale train, thankfully this never occurred, but there were two frightful instances. Once, 5-year-old Tommy wandered after a butterfly and vanished into tall grass near the Platte. The entire wagon train halted for an hour, frantically searching. They found him eventually by following the distant sound of crying. He'd realized he was lost and sat down wailing behind a rise. The relief was immense. His mother nearly fainted from the surge of emotion after scouring every bush calling his name. Another time in the Blue Mountains, 3 kids exploring a creek took a wrong turn up a side draw. They were missing by dusk, and a search party with lanterns went out. They came back late at night with the trio in tow, tired and mosquito-bitten, but safe. The children got scoldings and extra hugs. It was notable how the older children became protectors of the younger on the trail. Families banded together, with older siblings almost acting in parental roles when needed. Teenage boys would carry little ones on their back when they got too weary. Adolescent girls sang lullabies to soothe fussy infants so that their exhausted mothers could catch a break. There was a collective approach to child care. If one mother was occupied, another would mind her toddlers, all understanding that survival out here was a group effort. As the wagon train neared Oregon, children played an important role in one of the final challenges, the descent of the Columbia River. Families had to decide whether to float down the river or take the rugged Barlow Road around Mount Hood. Either route was arduous, but many opted to raft down the Columbia. For children, the idea of riding a raft or canoe was equal parts thrilling and scary. When the Hales and a few others hired a large canoe and some Indian guides at the Dales, Anna and Eli wore crude life jackets made of tied-together empty gourds and ropes. Innovation one father devised after hearing of drownings. As the canoe shot the rapids, the adults were tense and terrified. One lady indeed screamed every second, as Lydia Rudd's diary noted. But some children couldn't help feeling it was like a carnival ride on a wild river. Eli actually squealed in delight at a big splash until a stern look from Clara silenced him. This was life or death after all, not play. That said, when they safely navigated to calm waters, the children's exhilaration spilled over, and many declared it the best boat ride ever. The weariness of months seemed momentarily forgotten in that adrenaline rush. Finally, upon arrival in the Willamette Valley, it was often remarked how much the trail children had grown. Physically, many shot up from all the exercise and hearty, if plain, diet. Clothing that fit in Missouri was threadbare and too short by Oregon. Mentally, they had matured beyond their years. A 12-year-old boy on reaching the valley was likely as capable as a grown man in tasks like driving cattle or chopping wood, because he'd been doing it under harsh conditions. A 10-year-old girl could manage a household's basic needs, having helped her mother across miles of necessity. They still retained childish joy. They ran to pick the abundant flowers of Oregon, marveled at the towering fir trees, and splashed in the clear streams. But they carried themselves with a certain frontier confidence. The friendships forged among trail children were deep. Having gone through so much together, many vowed to stay in touch even as their families claimed land miles apart. Some of these bonds lasted a lifetime, with trail mates visiting each other's homesteads years later. Reminiscing about that time, Johnny and Frankie raced their ponies past Chimney Rock, or when little Susie said something funny to a Sioux chief, and everyone laughed. These shared memories were the glue of the pioneer community. They had a common epic of childhood that set them apart from future generations who'd simply be born in Oregon. In quiet moments, perhaps as a grandmother, Anna might think back to the trail, recalling not the hardships, but the wonders as seen through her young eyes. The first time she slept under the entire Milky Way with no roof, and realized how big the universe was. Or when an Indian girl gave her a doll at Fort Hall, and she realized different cultures could be friends. Or the intense pride she felt when her father said she'd been a good, brave girl for walking all those miles without complaint. These were formative experiences that no conventional upbringing could replicate. The Oregon Trail was a crucible for pioneer children, forging strong, adaptable, and often remarkably optimistic individuals. They were the ones who would grow up to build the new land, armed with the toughness of trail life and the dreamful imagination of having traversed a continent as kids. Thus, in the story of the Oregon Trail, the chapter of childhood is one of resilience and innocence entwined. The children suffered and cried, but they also played and grew. In their memories, the trail was as much a giant playground and discovery zone as it was a place of hardship. And in their character, one can see the seeds of the Western spirit, curious, bold, cooperative, and hopeful, sown during those 2,000 miles on foot to Oregon. Chapter 8. The Final Push. Over the Cascades. By the time the wagon train reached the eastern foothills of the Cascade Range, autumn had arrived, and with it a sense of both urgency and anticipation. They had been on the trail for many months, and the weariness was palpable. Yet the knowledge that their destination lay just beyond this final barrier filled them with determination. Before them loomed the Cascade Mountains, cloaked in dense forests and already sprinkled with early snow on the highest peaks. They had two choices to reach the Willamette Valley on the other side: follow the Columbia River around the mountains, or attempt the new Barlow Road, an overland route that cut through the Cascade forests south of Mount Hood, thus avoiding the dangerous Columbia Rapids. Each option carried risks, and either way, this stretch would be one of the hardest of all. With winter's breath not far behind them, they pressed on for the final push, hearts set on soon standing in the green valleys of Oregon. At the Dalles, the end of the overland trail along the Columbia, the wagon train paused to regroup. The Dalles was little more than a trading post and a natural river portage, named for the columnar basalt rocks that pinched the Columbia into boiling rapids. Emigrants often had to stop here to decide their route. Throughout the summer, some pioneers had rafted from the Dalles to Fort Vancouver, but those who came later in the season faced low water, high winds, and fewer available boats. The Hales arrived in late September, when the river was both low and windy. On scouting, Jacob learned that a couple of large wooden barges, scows, were ferrying emigrants downriver, but the wait list was long and the cost high. Meanwhile, word came that Sam Barlow's new wagon road over the mountains, opened just a year or two prior, was passable, though rugged. After a meeting among the wagon captains and families, the Hales Company decided to split. A few wagons, including William's employers, the Morrisons, and George's Simmons party, opted to raft down the Columbia to save their exhausted cattle, while the rest, including the Hales and Marshes, would try the Barlow Road to keep their wagons and livestock with them. This was a poignant parting of ways. They had traveled together for so long, and now they embraced with tears and promises to meet in Oregon City. Clara pressed spare bandages and herbs into the hand of her friend, who'd be on the rafts, knowing river travel had its perils. William faced a dilemma. His black friend George and the Simmons were taking the water route, as they planned to go north of the Columbia after, while William's own employer family chose the overland. In a heartfelt conversation, George and William decided to say goodbye here. They clasped hands firmly. George, eyes misty, told William, "We'll meet again in Washington Territory. Save a dance for me when you marry that Oregon girl someday." William laughed and blinked away tears, promising to visit across the river come spring. They gave each other a quick brotherly hug, aware that in this era, their solidarity as black pioneers was something precious. Then they went their separate paths, George to the canoes by the riverside, and William back to yoking up oxen for the climb ahead. The two contingents waved until out of sight, each secretly praying for the other's safety. The Barlow Road proved to be everything they had heard. An incredibly strenuous route, barely more than a rough trail hacked through forest and over steep ridges. It was the first wagon road across the Cascades, and in 1845 Samuel Barlow and his team had carved it in desperation to avoid the Columbia's dangers. But by 1850 or so, it was still primitive. The Hales and their companions paid a toll at the Barlow Gate, a few dollars, or some provisions, to support maintenance of the road, and then plunged into the deep fir forests of Mount Hood slopes. At first, traveling under the canopy of giant Douglas fir, hemlock, and cedar felt like entering a hushed green cathedral. The path was soft with needles, and the smell of evergreen and damp earth was refreshing. It was a dramatic change from the sage and dust of weeks prior. Anna exclaimed that it felt like twilight at noon, so thick were the trees. Moss-draped branches like garlands, and occasional sunbeams pierced through, illuminating ferns and mushrooms on the forest floor. But soon the challenges of this landscape became apparent. The road took them up and down extremely steep pitches. Wagon wheels had to be locked with chains to slow descent on inclines. Even then, several wagons slid dangerously or toppled into trees. On one uphill, they had to double team. 8 oxen pulling one wagon up a muddy slope, then going back to get the next. Progress slowed to perhaps a mile or 2 per day. They crossed countless small creeks and a few larger streams. At Rock Creek, the crossing was so rough that one wagon's tongue snapped. They spent half a day felling a young tree and carving a replacement yoke by hand. The weather turned sullen. Chilly rains typical of Oregon fall. Before long, everyone was soaked through. Camping was miserable as wet wood made it hard to keep fires going. A few nights they even slept cold meals rather than fuss with sputtering flames. Some began to doubt if the road was better than the river after all. But then they met a traveler coming from the west, an express rider carrying mail back east. He cheered them. Just another 2 days, and they'd be through the worst, he said. And the valley was mild and sunny right now. That news was like honey. They pushed on with renewed spirit. One notorious section was Laurel Hill, a nearly vertical downslope where the road builders had nailed wooden cleats to trees and stumps to act as winch points. It was so steep that some wagons had to be lowered with ropes wrapped around trees to break them. The Hales confronted this obstacle on a foggy morning. Standing at the top of Laurel Hill, they could scarcely see the bottom through mist and towering trees. The descent looked impossibly sheer. There was evidence of past wagons' struggles, gouges in tree trunks from ropes, pieces of broken wagons abandoned in ravines. One diarist, Rev McAllister, driving stock down the Cascades, had described similar spots where it was hardly passable for mountain goats, much less stock. That felt apt as Jacob looked at their cattle. The poor creatures would have to somehow scramble down. They proceeded with extreme caution. They unloaded wagons to lighten them, carrying goods down by pack and on their backs in multiple trips. They cut additional fir saplings to act as brake poles. One wagon at a time was then lowered. A large rope looped around a sturdy tree at the top as a friction brake, the wagon tied to it, and several men easing it out down the incline. Women and children waited at top or bottom, holding their breath. Even with all precautions, one smaller wagon still got away. The rope snapped, frayed from months of use. With a shout, the men jumped aside as the wagon careened. It crashed down, splitting apart against a stump halfway. Fortunately, no one was in it, and nothing was in it. They'd unloaded it. But the vehicle was ruined. It belonged to the Parkers, an elderly couple. They took it in stride. At journey's end, "What use is a wagon anyway?" Mr. Parker joked. They salvaged what wood they could for later repairs on other wagons, and left the rest. The oxen of that team were led down separately. Seeing that accident put everyone on edge, but they finished lowering the remaining wagons without incident, albeit with frayed nerves and burning muscles. At Laurel Hill's base, they reassembled. Some people had minor injuries, a twisted ankle here, rope burns there. They rested half a day to recover. Mrs. Parker, whose wagon was lost, was invited to ride with the Hales until journey's end, which wasn't far now. That night, around the fire, Isaiah Marsh proclaimed that nothing worse could possibly lie ahead after conquering that hill. And he was right. Mostly. The remainder of the Barlow Road was tough, but not harrowing. They had to ford the Sandy River several times, a cold, milky, glacial stream. One crossing was deep enough to float a wagon briefly, causing a panic until oxen found footing again. They passed Mount Hood, its immense snowy bulk occasionally visible through breaks in the clouds, a silent white sentinel guiding them. On September 28th, the sun broke through midday, and there, below them as they came out of the mountains, stretched the broad, forested valley of the Willamette. Shouts of joy erupted. They could see open prairies dotted with oak trees, and beyond, a shimmering line which must be the Willamette River itself. Far to the north, a faint outline of another great mountain, Mount St. Helens, or perhaps Rainier, loomed. The promised land lay just ahead. As they descended into the valley, the climate noticeably changed. Gone was the thin, crisp mountain air and biting chill. Here it was milder, with a soft breeze carrying the scent of rich soil and decaying autumn leaves. And oh, the grass. After the bleak Snake River plains and the dark forest gloom, the rolling grasslands were a welcome sight for sore eyes and hungry animals. They made camp that night on the first flat plain they found, near a clear stream with salmon darting in pools. Some of the men cast fishing lines and caught supper easily, fat silver salmon, which they roasted on sticks. The women found wild apple trees and gathered some small tart apples to stew with precious sugar for a treat. Children ran chasing countless geese and ducks that frequented the area, a waterfowl abundance they'd never seen. "It feels like we entered paradise," Clara whispered to Jacob that evening, watching the sunset paint the western sky orange over the valley. The next day, they traveled a short distance to Oregon City, the unofficial end of the trail and the first American town in this part of Oregon. It was a modest settlement, with perhaps a few hundred residents. But to the weary emigrants, it looked like metropolis. They saw tidy cabins with actual gardens, a sawmill by the falls of the Willamette, stores where one could buy supplies, at steep prices but available, and people who were not emigrating but settled, some even in clean clothes. The reaction among the wagon train was mixed, elation to finally arrive, but also a sort of anticlimax and uncertainty. After so long moving, the prospect of stopping felt strange. Some children apparently asked, "Are we there already?" Months had become their new normal. In Oregon City, they officially ended their journey. Emigrants registered land claims or inquired where free land was open. the Hales learned that an area a few miles south, near a fork of the Willamette, was being claimed by new settlers, including some they knew from the wagon train. It sounded promising. Good water, plenty of timber, and neighbors they trusted. They decided to stake their claim there. The Marshes chose a spot a bit further upstream. William's employer, the Morrison family, initially camped outside town, planning to go to a donation land north of the Columbia, as William had to settle outside Oregon territory due to exclusion laws. They intended to help him set up there if possible. There was much paperwork and provisional government stuff to sort. The provisional government and Hudson's Bay Company both had influence, and America's territorial officials had recently arrived too. But those details did not dampen the triumph. They had made it. 5 months and 21 days since leaving Independence, Missouri, Jacob recorded in his journal at Oregon City. Of the roughly 50 people who had set out in their wagon company, they lost only 4 to death, 2 adults, 2 children, along the way. A toll that was nonetheless heavy with grief, but comparatively merciful given cholera and other trains' tragedies. Many more oxen and cows were gone or used up, wagons broken, goods depleted. But the core was intact. The people and their spirit. A small welcome celebration was held on the grassy square in Oregon City for the newly arrived trains. Settlers who had come in previous years brought fresh bread, smoked venison, and even a bit of wine or whiskey to share. They slapped the newcomers on the back, saying, "Well done, now the real work begins." There was laughter, nervous perhaps, but genuine. A fiddler, emigrated 2 years back, struck up "Home Sweet Home," and though their old homes were far behind, it resonated because here they would build new ones. Couples danced slowly on the trodden grass. Children frolicked around them, chasing each other in pure glee. Clara and Jacob swayed together, eyes moist. They were bone-tired, ragged, and thinner than when they left Missouri, but they were together and safe. "We made it," Jacob whispered, forehead to hers. Clara nodded, a tear escaping. She thought of those who didn't live to see this day, Mrs. Taylor, little Joseph, and felt a pang. But she also felt their presence urging her to live fully in honor of them. So she straightened her shoulders and smiled, focusing on the warm hand of her husband in hers, the giggles of her children playing tag, and the gentle breeze carrying the scent of the fertile valley that would be her new home. Within days, the group dispersed to their claims. The Hales rode ferry across the Willamette with their wagon. The last ferry, Jacob joked, since the wagon was falling apart. They reached their land, 640 acres of meadow and timber along a creek, exactly as promised by the Donation Land Claim Act for a married couple. It was beautiful. Grasses waist-high, a fringe of oak and fir, and distant view of Mitt Hood's Peak on clear days. To them it seemed the promised land indeed. They pitched tents and immediately began felling trees for a cabin before winter truly set in. That night, after the first logs were laid for their cabin, Jacob lit a lantern and hung it on an oak branch. The family gathered under it, wrapped in quilts. It was quiet. No wagon train, no other campfires, just their own. The sky above was cloudy, typical Oregon, but occasionally a star winked through. They missed the companionship of their trail friends, but some neighbors were just a holler away and would join them in coming days to raise the cabin walls. For now, it was a moment of solitude and reflection. They prayed a prayer of thanks. When it came time to sleep, Clara and Jacob carried the dozing children to their bedrolls. The parents lingered a bit, looking out into the darkness where unknown wild creatures and future challenges lurked. "It feels strange to not have to travel tomorrow," Clara admitted softly. Jacob agreed. They both felt a twinge. So much had been about reaching here, and now that they were here, an era of their life closed. But a new one was dawning, full of promise. They could almost hear the ghostly rumble of wagon wheels still in their ears. But it was time to unhitch and begin living on this land. The final push was over. They had pushed not only their wagons over mountains, but pushed themselves beyond prior limits. They were Oregon pioneers now. Over the coming weeks, news trickled in from others. The raft party made it safely. Though one canoe overturned, everyone rescued, and the Simmons Bush Group decided to winter near Fort Vancouver. Mary, who lost her baby, was taken in by a family in town until she recovered her health. William parted amicably from the Morrisons and joined George north of the Columbia, where they founded a community with several other black families, a place that would become a haven known as Bush Prairie. The extended saga of each didn't end at Trail's End, but the chapter of the Oregon Trail did, and mostly on a joyful note. For years afterward, whenever former wagon mates met in town or at gatherings, they would reminisce about the last stretch over the Cascades, and who had it rougher, the Barlow Roaders or the river rafters. Good-natured teasing flew, but all agreed. The sweetest sight was the Willamette Valley opening up after endless miles. One pioneer woman later wrote, "When I gazed upon the valley from the mountain, I felt like old Moses viewing the promised land, and all my hardships were repaid in that moment." Many felt that way. They had seen the elephant, the saying for experiencing the full ordeal, and they had prevailed. Thus ended their trail, not at a particular milepost, but in the soil they tilled and the homes they built. The final push over the Cascades was both an end and a beginning. It was the last trial of the journey and the first trial of settlement. Looking back on it years later, the pioneers often said that knowing what lay beyond those mountains, a good land where they prospered, they would do it all again. Some even did, journeying back east to fetch relatives and returning west with another train. But for most, once was enough. They settled into the quieter but still challenging life of farmers and townsfolk. On that first night in their own Oregon claim, Clara fell asleep to a new sound, the distant hoot of an owl and the soft rush of the creek nearby. No oxbell, no guard calling out time, no baby crying in a neighboring wagon. Just the sounds of nature and her family's breathing. She realized she missed some of the trail commotion, but also that this peace was what they had been journeying toward. Her last thought before sleep was a humble one. We are home. Chapter 9. Reflections at Journey's End. Camped at last on Oregon soil, the pioneers found themselves reflecting on the epic journey they had completed. In the evenings during those first weeks of settlement, many a conversation around a hearth or campfire turned to recollections of the trail. The trials overcome, the comrades lost and gained, and how the experience had changed them. What had it really been like to live on the Oregon Trail? Now, at the end, they could afford to ask that question and attempt an answer. These reflections were often meditative and slow-paced, as if their minds, having been so long in motion, were finally catching up to the profound significance of their trek. For Jacob Hale, a man not usually given to poetic sentiment, the journey had a clear arc of purpose. He had left Missouri with a tangible goal, land and opportunity for his family. Now, with claim papers in hand and fertile ground under his boots, he felt vindicated. But he also realized the cost. Sitting on a split log stool by his half-built cabin, he wrote a letter to a friend back home. "We have come to the far edge of America, friend. The road here was lined with graves and hardships as much as with milestones and wonders. I fancy we lived a lifetime in those months." He described day-to-day life on the trail, how walking became meditation, each step carrying hopes westward, even as it trod over the remnants of those who fell. He admitted there were times he doubted. The night of the cholera scare, the morning their wagon nearly tipped in the Platte, the storm that shredded nerves. Yet each time Providence provided, be it a spring in the desert or a friendly hand, or just the sheer grit of our company to pull together, he wrote. He concluded that he understood his own strength and faith more deeply now. The Oregon Trail had tempered him like steel in a forge. He closed the letter by urging his friend to come out west if he could, but not without caution. It will demand everything of you, but it will give you back more than you thought possible. Clara's reflections were often more inward and emotional. In her journal in Oregon, she penned a passage months after arrival. "I still wake before dawn, expecting to hear the jangle of trace chains or the murmur of travelers stirring, as on the trail. Then I remember, I am in my own bed, in my own cabin. The journey ended. I feel both relief and a strange longing." She found herself missing aspects of trail life, the close camaraderie, the ever-changing horizon, even the feeling of purpose each sunrise, pack up and move, closer to a dream. Now, settled, routine life seemed almost too still. But when such feelings arose, she walked to a small rise near their claim, where on clear days she could see far across the valley. There, she would recall specific days of the journey. The view of Chimney Rock at sunset, the kindness of the Shoshone at Fort Hall trading berries, the laughter of children playing in the Platte, the solemn quiet after burying a loved one by the Sweetwater. She realized those memories were now part of her, woven into her character. Her compassion had deepened. Her perspective on what truly mattered had sharpened. "I learned on that long road that home is not a place, but the people with whom you share hardship and joy," she wrote in a letter to her sister. She told her sister that if she ever felt lonely or afraid, she should think of Clara out west, under God's vast sky, persevering, and know that strength resides in all of us if called upon. The children had perhaps the purest reflections. Years later, when asked by newcomers or their own kids about the trail, they'd recall sensory imprints. The taste of cold river water after a dusty day. That was the best drink I ever had. Or, I remember the sound of the wind across the prairie at night. It could howl like a ghost or sometimes sing soft as a lullaby. Young Eli, once grown, confessed that as a boy he hadn't grasped the magnitude of the journey. He just lived each day as it came. Only later did he realize he had walked across a continent at age 5. That realization gave him confidence in life. "If I could cross the Rockies as a kindergartner, I can handle any trouble now," he'd joke. The trail had been a teacher, giving them adaptability and a trove of stories that would last a lifetime. Many who were children in wagon trains eventually became the community storytellers. Their oral histories would become the stuff of local legends and later written pioneer histories. Even William, who settled across the Columbia, often reflected on the journey's impact. For him, the trail had been both liberation and revelation. Around friendly fires in his new community, he would recount how he had never felt as equal and free as when working side by side with white compatriots to haul a wagon out of mud or splitting the last biscuit with a hungry neighbor. On the trail, a man was judged by his actions, not his skin, at least in the microcosm of their particular train. He knew prejudice lingered in the wider world. Indeed, Oregon's laws barred him from settling, hence his move north. But having lived the trail, he also knew that people could choose to cooperate and see each other's humanity under extreme circumstances. That hope colored his view of mankind. When his children or grandchildren asked about the hardest part of the journey, William sometimes surprised them by saying, "Leaving was the hardest, cutting ties and stepping into the unknown. After that, every step was easier because at least we were doing something." The journey taught him that bold action trumped fearful hesitation. The wagon train as a whole had become almost like a large family, and even after scattering to claims, they maintained bonds. They started an annual reunion picnic each summer in the Willamette Valley, where dozens of former trail mates gathered under Oregon oaks to celebrate the anniversary of their arrival. They'd roast a whole ox or pig, lay out potluck dishes from new gardens and farms, quite a cornucopia compared to trail rations, and spend the day in fellowship. At these picnics, storytelling was the main entertainment. A natural order of narrative emerged: departure and farewells, the prairies and first buffalo sighting, then Platt's dusty leagues and cholera's toll, Fort Laramie's respite, the mountain ascent, and the poignant crossing of South Pass, the trials of Snake River and Blue Mountains, the rafting versus Barlow debate, and finally the joyous descent into the valley. Each tale grew with each telling, sometimes embellished for humor or drama. They teased one another lovingly, like how old Mr. Higgins always slept through the worst storm, or how Mrs. Reed once scolded a river ferry captain as if he were a disobedient schoolboy, and likely saved them all by forcing him to be more careful. Laughter and tears flowed in equal measure, a catharsis of memory. At one such reunion, a minister who had traveled with them gave a short speech, summing up the shared sentiment. "We have passed through a fiery furnace of trial and come out not burned, but purified. Let us ever be grateful for each day of health on the trail, for each stranger who gave us aid, for each morning we woke to continue when some did not. We saw God's grandeur in nature from the endless plains to the highest mountains. We learned the strength of community and the resilience of the human spirit. The Oregon Trail was a crucible that has forged us into one people, no longer Missourians or Hoosiers or Yankees, but Oregonians, pioneers of the West." The gathered crowd murmured in agreement, many wiping their eyes. They then sang "Amazing Grace," a hymn that had comforted them across many a mile, its verses now even more meaningful. "Through many dangers, toils, and snares, we have already come. 'Twas grace that brought us safe thus far, and grace will lead us home." In quieter personal moments, pioneers often wrote letters back home, trying to capture what the trail was like. These letters became treasured first-hand accounts for those who would follow. A pioneer named Lydia wrote to her relatives that the journey was both more difficult than words can tell and more rewarding than I could have imagined. We suffered cold, heat, thirst, and fear. We lost the trail at times, and at others we thought we might lose our minds from the sameness of the days. But then I saw sunsets that seemed painted by angels, and I rode my horse alongside herds of buffalo that made the ground tremble. I shared my bread with a half-starved traveler, and he with me, and both went on strengthened. I held a dying friend in my arms one night, and the next morning I danced for joy because we crossed a great river safely. Such extremes we lived. I believe I am older in spirit by years, though only months have passed. Letters like this circulated in newspapers and by word of mouth, fueling both awe and apprehension in those considering the trip. Some would decide against it, deeming it too perilous. But many were drawn by the tales, adventure and opportunity wrapped in one. The Oregon Trail became an American epic in the making. In their reflections, pioneers also remembered and honored the diverse peoples they met. Interactions with Native Americans, in hindsight, were seen in a poignant light. Many realized that while they moved in as settlers, the tribes they encountered were seeing the beginning of an end to their way of life. Some pioneers wrote with empathy about the hospitality of the plateau tribes, or the curiosity of plains children who had raced the wagons on their ponies, and they hoped for peaceful coexistence. Sadly, history would not always follow that hope. But in those early reflective years, at least a few pioneer communities fostered goodwill, inviting tribal neighbors to trade or feast. In some diaries, pioneers credited native guides outright for their survival. Were it not for an Indian showing us a hidden spring at a critical juncture, we surely would have perished of thirst, is a common type of entry. These memories served as a reminder that their conquest of the trail was not solely by their own wits. It was often with the help and knowledge of those who had trod these paths for centuries. Time passed, and the Oregon Trail gradually changed, from a rugged wagon track to stagecoach routes, to portions being overtaken by railroads. But for those who walked it in its heyday, their reflections rarely faded. In old age, they'd sit on porches or by fireplaces and recount to grandchildren about the time the oxen stampeded at midnight, or the 4th of July we celebrated by Independence Rock with buffalo meat and found an eagle feather, truly a sign. Some stories took on legendary status, improved in each retelling for dramatic effect. Yet, at their core, these reminiscences were an attempt to convey to those who hadn't been there the magnitude of the experience, how it tested every fiber of your being, revealed character, and ultimately, how it felt to stand on the far end of the continent, having carried oneself there by will and faith. One recurring theme in these reflections is wonder at what they endured and at the land they crossed. Many could hardly believe it themselves. A pioneer might gaze at a map and trace the route with a gnarled finger to a grandchild. See, we started here, went up this river, across these plains. Yes, all the way, then over these mountains here. Took us half a year. And we did it without airplanes or automobiles or phones, just oxen, our feet, and grit. The child's eyes would grow wide. "Weren't you scared, Grandma?" they'd ask. "Oh, plenty of times," Grandma would reply. But I had your grandpa, and we had a community of good folks. We took care of each other. Whenever something bad happened, people stepped up. We prayed a lot, too. And I believe we had angels watching over us on that trail. These intimate accounts transmitted values along with facts: courage, cooperation, endurance, and faith. In sober moments, they also reflected on the cost. Emigrant registers indicate thousands died on the trail from 1840s through 1860s. Pioneers in Oregon would sometimes visit the little cemeteries or isolated graves in their new homeland of those who started the journey but never finished it. A marker reading, "Sacred to the memory of Martha Hill, age 3, died 1852 on Sweetwater," transplanted by a grieving family to their final home's graveyard, stood as a testament to sacrifice. The survivors felt a duty to live well in honor of those who paid the ultimate price for the dream of Oregon. In conclusion, the collected reflections of those who lived on the Oregon Trail form a meditative chorus of voices. They speak of hardship and hope, terror and beauty, loss and triumph. The tone is often calm and reverent, as if discussing a pilgrimage. And indeed it was a kind of pilgrimage, a journey of faith in a better future, of going west not only to find a place, but to become a new people. By living through that odyssey, the pioneers discovered depths within themselves and bonds with each other that transformed them. Now settled in the fertile valleys, as they rocked on porches in twilight or strolled through golden wheat fields ready for harvest, they carried that trail within them. A quiet strength, a memory of endless horizons that kept their spirits expansive. Life would present new challenges: building a state, civil war back east, societal changes, but they would face them with the seasoned calm of those who had walked through fire, or hail, or alkali dust, and come out the other side. In their twilight years, some pioneers would be asked by curious journalists or young writers, "If you could, would you do it all over again?" Often, a wrinkled face would break into a knowing smile. "Yes," they would say softly, perhaps gazing towards the west. "Yes, I would. It was hard, harder than you can imagine. But I've never felt more alive, before or since, as in those days on the Oregon Trail." And with that gentle affirmation, their eyes would close, hearing in memory the creak of wagon wheels and the lullaby of coyote songs under the vast prairie sky. A chapter of their life, forever vivid, forever cherished.